Chief Petty Officer Elena Vance was wiping hydraulic fluid from a cracked O-ring with a rag that smelled of old diesel and Maine pine, when the vibration in the hull of the USS Tallmadge shifted from a steady B-flat to a discordant, metallic grind that no one else on the hangar deck seemed to notice. It was 0314 hours, the dead space of the mid-watch where the air in the belly of a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship turns thick with the exhaled breath of 4,000 sleeping sailors and the unyielding scent of JP-5 jet fuel. To anyone else, the shudder was just the sea, the Atlantic pushing back against 45,000 tons of American steel as they churned through a swell 300 miles off the coast of Cape Hatteras. But Elena didn't live in the world of anyone else. She lived in the frequency of the machine. She felt the ship through the soles of her steel-toed boots, a tactile map of pressure and torque that she had been refining since she was 6 years old, standing in a flooded salvage yard in Deer Isle, Maine, watching her father pull the soul out of a drowned lobster boat. She stood perfectly still, the oily rag frozen in her hand, her eyes narrowing as she looked not at the hangar deck, but threw it down into the dark, wet lungs of the ship where the sea chests and the reduction gears lived. The Tallmadge was screaming, but she was screaming in a language only Elena spoke, a high-frequency tectonic moan that meant the metal was tired of being a boat. She was 34 years old, and her skin bore the permanent constellations of a life spent in the guts of things, tiny white scars from pressurized steam. A faded tattoo of a compass rose on her inner wrist that she'd gotten in Norfolk after her first deployment, and a layer of grease under her fingernails that no amount of industrial soap could ever quite reach. She was an aviation structural mechanic, a tin basher in Navy parlance, but that was just the label the Department of Defense put on her paycheck. In reality, Elena Vance was a structural dowser. She could find the break before it happened. She could hear the air bubble in a hydraulic line from 3 compartments away. It was a capability that made her an asset to the machinery and a ghost to the officers who walked the P-ways. To the brass, she was a component, reliable, quiet, and replaceable. "Chief, you okay?" The voice came from behind a stack of crated rotor blades. It belonged to Petty Officer 3rd Class Aiden "Sketch" Miller, a 20-year-old kid from a suburb in Ohio who spent his off-watch hours drawing hyperrealistic portraits of the ship's internal wiring in a tattered moleskine. He was the only one who really looked at Elena, mostly because he was fascinated by the way her hands moved without her looking at them. Elena didn't turn around. She kept her feet planted, feeling the deck. The vibration had settled back into its B-flat rhythm, but the resonance was wrong. It was hollow. "Did you feel that, Miller?" "Feel what? The swell?" "Yeah, it's getting choppy. Command says we're skirting the edge of that low-pressure system coming up from the Gulf." "Not the swell," Elena said, her voice low and raspy, the product of a decade of shouting over turbine whine. "The harmonics, the secondary shaft, it's dragging." Sketch stepped out from the crates, his charcoal-stained fingers tapping against his thigh. He listened. He really tried to listen. All he heard was the rhythmic thud of the ventilation fans and the distant, reassuring hum of the ship's heartbeat. "Sounds normal to me, Chief. Maybe a little heavy on the pitch, but we're making 20 knots. Elena finally turned. Her face was a study in controlled architecture, high cheekbones, eyes the color of a winter Atlantic, and a mouth that rarely wasted a word. She didn't look worried. She looked focused, the kind of focus that made people uncomfortable because it suggested she was seeing a truth they were blind to. "It's not the pitch. It's the casing. Something is rubbing. Go to the shop and get me the ultrasonic leak detector and the long-range stethoscope. Don't check it out. Just take it. Chief, if Mr. Sterling sees me raiding the locker without a work order, he's gonna have my head. He's already on a tier about the maintenance backlog on the Harriers." "Sterling doesn't know the difference between a torque wrench and a toaster," Elena said, her tone devoid of malice but heavy with the weight of experience. "Tell him I sent you. Or don't tell him anything. Just get the gear." Sketch hesitated, seeing the tightness in her jaw. He'd seen her like this once before, 3 months ago, just before a fire broke out in a secondary pump room. She'd sensed the heat before the sensors had even flickered. He nodded once and disappeared into the shadows of the hangar. Elena stayed in the silence. She walked over to one of the massive steel pillars that braced the hangar deck and pressed her palm against it. The metal was cold, vibrating with the life of the ship, She closed her eyes. In her mind, the asterisk Tallmadge asterisk became transparent. She saw the miles of piping, the massive shafts, the thousands of rivets holding the Atlantic Ocean at bay. She followed the sound down. It wasn't in the hangar, it was deeper. It was in the void spaces, the double-bottom tanks that no one entered unless the ship was in dry dock. It was a rhythmic grinding, like a giant's teeth gnashing together in the dark. She remembered the salvage yard in Maine. Her father, a man who spoke more to engines than to people, had once told her that every machine has a breaking point, and if you're quiet enough, it will tell you exactly where it is. "Laney," he'd said, his hands stained with the black blood of a Caterpillar diesel. "People lie because they are afraid or they're greedy. But steel is honest. It only breaks when it can't carry the weight anymore. Your job isn't to fix the break. It's to hear the scream before it happens." She had joined the Navy not out of a sense of patriotic theater, but because the world of civilian salvage was too small. She wanted the biggest machines human beings could build. She wanted to be the one who kept the giants breathing, and for 12 years she had been exactly that. She had saved a carrier's propulsion system in the Persian Gulf by identifying a microscopic flaw in a cooling line. She had prevented a catastrophic landing deck failure during a storm in the Pacific. And she had done it all while remaining invisible, a chief petty officer who didn't play the political games of the mess, who didn't seek the spotlight, and who treated her uniform like a set of coveralls that just happened to have anchors on the collar. The sound of boots on the non-skid flooring announced the arrival of Lieutenant Commander Sterling. He was a man who looked like he had been manufactured in an officer production facility. Perfectly pressed khakis, a haircut that cost $40 in a Georgetown barber shop, and a posture that suggested he was constantly posing for a recruitment poster. He was the maintenance officer, 3 years younger than Elena and a lifetime behind her in actual knowledge. "Chief Vance," Sterling said, his voice echoing in the empty hangar. "I was looking for Miller. Someone said he was headed toward the tool locker. We have 3 AV-8BS that need their landing gear cycled before the 0600 launch. Why aren't you in the shop?" Elena didn't take her hand off the pillar. She didn't snap to attention, though she maintained the professional distance required by her rank. "Miller is on an errand for me, sir. I'm tracking a vibration in the hull. It's coming from the starboard aft quarter." Sterling sighed, a sound of practiced condescension. He checked his watch. "Vance, we're in the middle of a sea trial. The ship is supposed to vibrate. We're pushing the engines to 90% rated power to test the new fuel injectors. Of course, you're feeling a vibration." "It's not the engines, Commander," Elena said, her voice steady, ignoring the irritation prickling at the back of her neck. "The engines are running at 3,600 RPM. This frequency is lower. It's structural. It feels like a cavitation issue in the sea chest, or maybe a mounting bracket in the shaft Allie has sheared. It's creating a resonance that's echoing through the frames." Sterling walked closer, his boots clicking with an annoying precision. He looked at the pillar she was touching, then at her grease-stained hand. "You're feeling it." "With your hand?" "Yes, sir. Chief, we have millions of dollars in sensors on this ship. We have a bridge full of computers monitoring every PSI and every degree of temperature. If there was a structural issue, I'd have a red light on my console and a team of engineers from NAVSEA on the radio. You're a mechanic. You're here to turn wrenches on aircraft. You're not a naval architect, and you're certainly not a sonar tech." Elena looked at him then. She didn't look angry. She looked at him the way an adult looks at a child who is explaining how the moon follows the car. "The sensors are calibrated for catastrophic failure, sir. They monitor thresholds. They don't monitor harmony. By the time your red light comes on, the metal will already be past its fatigue limit. I'm telling you, something is wrong in the deep water." "The deep water," Sterling repeated, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Very poetic, Vance, but back in the real world we have a flight schedule. Get Miller back to the shop. I want those Harriers green deck ready in 2 hours. That's an order." He turned on his heel and walked away, the embodiment of a man who believed that if a problem wasn't on a spreadsheet, it didn't exist. Elena watched him go, her face a mask of controlled professional discipline. She felt the rage, but it wasn't the hot, explosive kind. It was cold. It was the rage of a person who sees the iceberg and is told by the captain to worry about the dinner menu. Sketch returned a few minutes later carrying a hard-sided plastic case. He looked nervous. "I got it, Chief, but Sterling almost caught me. He's in a mood." "He's always in a mood," Elena said, taking the case. "He's a man who lives in a world of paper. Paper doesn't scream when it's about to tear." She opened the case and pulled out the ultrasonic stethoscope. It was a specialized piece of equipment designed to hear the minute hissing of high-pressure leaks or the grinding of bearings long before they became audible to the human ear. She donned the headset and pressed the probe against the steel pillar. The world vanished. The fans, the distant voices of the night watch, the hum of the lights, all of it was filtered out. In her ears, the ship became a symphony of friction. She tuned the frequency, dialing past the roar of the ventilation and the throb of the main engines. There, it was a wet, rhythmic thud. Asterisk thumpes HHH. Thumpes HHH. Asterisk, it wasn't a bearing. It was the sound of water being forced through a space that was supposed to be airtight. It was the sound of a weeping wound in the ship's skin. And it was getting faster. "Chief," Sketch whispered, seeing the way her eyes went distant. Elena pulled the headset down around her neck. Her heart was beating a steady, rhythmic cadence against her ribs, but her hands were perfectly still. "We have a hull breach. It's small right now, probably a hairline fracture in a weld near the main intake, but the pressure from the speed we're making is acting like a wedge." "A breach? Chief, we'd have bilge alarms. The damage control station would be lighting up." "Not if it's in a void space," Elena said, already moving toward the hatch that led to the lower decks. "The voids are pressurized with air to keep them dry. If the water is coming in slow, it's just compressing the air. The sensors won't trip until the pressure equalizes and the water actually hits the deck sensors. By then, the fracture will be a foot wide." "What are we going to do?" "I'm going down there," Elena said. "You stay here. If I'm not back in 20 minutes or if you feel the ship lurch to starboard, you hit the general alarm. Don't call Sterling. Call the bridge. Tell them Chief Vance says the ship is taking on water in the aft void." "Chief, you can't go into the voids alone. It's a confined space violation. You need a safety observer, a gas-leak test, a permit." "The ship is sinking, Miller," she said, her voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. "It's doing it slowly and it's doing it quietly, but it's sinking. I don't have time for a permit." She didn't wait for his response. She vanished through the hatch, dropping down the steep ladder wells with a fluid, practiced grace. She moved through the levels of the ship, leaving the inhabited world behind. The air grew colder, smelling of salt and old rust. The lighting shifted from the bright white of the hangar to the dim, industrial amber of the engineering spaces. She passed a couple of firemen on their way to the mess decks, their eyes glazed with sleep, and they didn't even look at her. She was just a chief in coveralls, a part of the scenery. She reached the lowest level, the tank top, where the massive steel plates of the inner hull formed the floor. Below this was the void, a 4-foot-deep space of air and bracing that separated the ship's interior from the crushing weight of the Atlantic. She found the manhole cover for Void 4A. It was a heavy oval of steel secured by a dozen bolts. She pulled a ratcheting wrench from her belt. The sound of the metal teeth clicking was the only noise in the cramped, damp space. She worked with a terrifying efficiency, her muscles coiling and uncoiling as she broke the seal on each bolt. She was sweating now, the humidity of the deep compartments clinging to her skin like a second uniform. As she loosened the last bolt, a hiss of air escaped from the seal. It smelled of brine and wet metal. The pressure inside was higher than the air in the compartment. She pried the cover back, and the sound she had heard through the stethoscope was now raw and immediate. Asterisk gush. Spray. Hiss. Asterisk, she shone her flashlight into the hole. The beam cut through the darkness, reflecting off a swirling pool of black water. In the corner of the void, where the massive intake pipe for the cooling system met the hull, a jagged line of silver was visible. It was a crack in the weld, 6 inches long, and from it, a needle-thin jet of seawater was spraying with enough pressure to cut through human bone. Elena stared at it for a long breath. It was beautiful in a horrific way, the raw power of the ocean finding a way inside. The crack was vibrating, the metal around it humming with a frantic, dying energy. She knew what was happening. The ship's high speed was creating a venturi effect, pulling at the hull, while the internal pressure of the intake was pushing out. The weld was caught in the middle of a tug-of-war it couldn't win. She reached into the hole, her arm disappearing up to the shoulder in the freezing water. She felt for the edges of the crack. The metal was sharp, slicing into the pads of her fingers, but she didn't pull back. She needed to feel the depth of the fatigue. It wasn't just a surface crack. The entire plate was bowing. "Chief!" She looked up. Sketch was peering down the hatch, his face pale in the flashlight's beam. "Chief, Sterling is coming. He found out I took the gear. He's headed this way with the master at arms." Elena pulled her arm out of the void. Blood dripped from her fingers, mixing with the grease and salt water. She looked at her hand, then at the hole. She had maybe 10 minutes before the crack zipped open like a frozen zipper. "Let him come," Elena said, her voice remarkably calm. "But tell him to bring a welder and a cofferdam, and tell him to tell the captain to all stop. Now, Vance!" Sterling's voice boomed from the ladder well above. He appeared a moment later, his face flushed with anger, followed by a burly petty officer with a badge on his chest. "What the hell are you doing? You broke a seal on a void space. Do you have any idea what kind of safety violation this is? You're relieved, Chief. Hand over your ID and follow the MAA to the brig." Elena didn't move. She stood over the open manhole, the water dripping from her hand onto Sterling's polished boots. "Sir, look in the hole." "I don't care what's in the hole. You ignored a direct order, you misappropriated equipment, and you've compromised the integrity of the—" "Look in the hole, Commander," she said, and for the first time her voice wasn't just steady. It was dangerous. It was the voice of the sea itself. Sterling hesitated, the sheer authority in her tone stopping him mid-sentence. He stepped forward, leaning over the opening. He shone his own light down. He saw the water. He heard the hiss, but he didn't understand the physics. To him, it was just a leak. "So we have some seepage," Sterling said, straightening up and trying to reclaim his dignity. "It's a 20-year-old ship, Chief. Voids take on water. That's why we have bilge pumps. We'll log it and have the DC guys look at it in the morning. Now step away from the hatch." "It's not seepage," Elena said. She stepped toward him, her height nearly matching his, her grease-stained presence a stark contrast to his pristine khakis. "That's a structural fatigue failure in the primary sea chest weld. We're making 20 knots in a 6-foot swell. The hull is flexing. Every time we hit a wave, that crack is growing by a millimeter. If we don't stop the ship and relieve the pressure, that plate is going to fail. And when it fails, it's not going to be a leak. It's going to be a 4-foot hole in the bottom of the ship." Sterling laughed, a short, nervous sound. "A 4-foot hole? You're being hysterical, Vance. This is exactly why women—" He stopped himself, but the thought was already in the air. "It's a leak. I'm the maintenance officer. I make the call. Ma, take her." The master-at-arms stepped forward, reaching for Elena's arm. At that exact moment, the Tallmadge hit a rogue swell. The ship groaned, a deep, visceral sound that vibrated through the very marrow of their bones. Below them, in the dark void, the hiss changed. It became a roar. A geyser of freezing seawater erupted from the manhole, hitting the overhead with the force of a fire hose. The pressure was so immense it knocked Sterling off his feet, drenching him in seconds. The air in the compartment was suddenly filled with the mist of pulverized ocean. "All stop!" Elena screamed over the roar of the water. "Sketch, get to a comms station. Tell the bridge we have a catastrophic hull failure in Void 4A. Tell them to kill the engines." Sketch didn't hesitate. He scrambled up the ladder. Sterling was on the deck, gasping, his perfect hair plastered to his forehead. He looked at the water geysering out of the hole, water that was already several inches deep on the deck and rising fast. The minor leak had become a monster. He looked at Elena, his eyes wide with a terror that comes to men who realize their rank cannot protect them from the laws of physics. "What do we do?" Sterling stammered, his voice cracking. We have to close the hatch." "We can't close it," Elena shouted, grabbing a heavy steel wrench to use as a lever. "The pressure is too high. If we try to bolt that cover back on, the bolts will shear and turn into shrapnel. We have to find the source and plug it from the inside, or the whole compartment is going to flood and take the Tallmadge down by the stern." The ship began to shudder, the feeling of the engines being thrown into emergency reverse. The vibration was violent, the massive propellers fighting against the forward momentum of 45,000 tons. "You stay here," Elena said to Sterling, her voice cold and crystalline. She wasn't looking at him as an officer anymore. She was looking at him as a liability. "If the water reaches the level of the electrical trunks, you kill the breakers for this sector. Do you understand?" "Where are you going?" Sterling asked, his voice small. Elena looked at the churning, freezing water inside the void. She knew the layout. She knew where the intake valve was. If she could get inside, if she could reach the manual override for the sea chest, she could shut the external intake and stop the flow of water long enough for a repair team to weld a patch. But the void was filling fast. It was a tomb of steel and salt water. "I'm going into the deep water," she said. She didn't wait for his permission. She didn't look back to see if he was watching. She took a deep breath, the last dry air she would feel for a long time, and plunged into the manhole. The cold was an immediate physical blow. It felt like 1,000 needles piercing her skin at once. The water was dark, filled with the debris of 20 years of rust and sediment. She couldn't see anything. She had to rely on the map in her mind. She kicked down, her boots heavy, her coveralls dragging at her limbs. The roar of the water coming through the crack was deafening underwater, a chaotic, thrumming pressure that tried to push her away. She reached out, her hands finding the cold, slimy surface of the intake pipe. She pulled herself along it, her lungs already beginning to ache, the primal urge to scream for air clawing at her throat. She found the valve housing. It was a massive iron wheel, encrusted with salt and age. She grabbed it, bracing her feet against the hull, and pulled. It didn't move. She pulled again, her muscles screaming, her vision beginning to sparkle with the onset of hypoxia. The valve was frozen. The sea was winning. She thought of the salvage yard. She thought of her father's voice. Asterisk steel is honest, Laney. It only breaks when it can't carry the weight. Asterisk, she wasn't steel. She was flesh and bone. But she was the only thing standing between the asterisk Tallmadge asterisk and the bottom of the Atlantic. She shifted her grip, finding a leverage point she hadn't seen before, and poured every ounce of her will, her history, and her rage into the turn. Above her in the compartment, Sterling stood in knee-deep water, his hands shaking as he held onto the ladder. He watched the surface of the water in the manhole, waiting for Elena to reappear. Seconds turned into a minute. The ship had slowed to a crawl, the engines silent now, leaving only the sound of the rising water and the distant, frantic calls over the 1MC. "She's not coming up," Sterling whispered to the empty, wet air. "She's just a mechanic. Why isn't she coming up?" Deep in the void, Elena Vance felt a sudden, sharp asterisk crack asterisk. It wasn't the hull. It was the valve. The wheel turned an inch. Then another. The roar of the water began to change its pitch, shifting from a scream to a hiss, and then, finally, to a gurgle. She turned the wheel until her arms failed, until the last of the air in her lungs was a burning coal. She let go, her body floating upward, her head hitting the underside of the manhole cover. She fumbled for the opening, her fingers numb, the world fading to a dull, gray blur. A hand reached into the water. It wasn't Sterling's hand. It was Sketch, who had returned with a rescue line. He grabbed the collar of her coveralls and hauled her up, dragging her out of the hole and onto the flooded deck. Elena collapsed, coughing up salt water, her chest heaving as she drew in the oily, metallic air of the ship. She lay there for a moment, the cold seeped into her bones, looking up at the amber emergency lights. Sterling was standing a few feet away, looking at her with an expression that was part awe and part profound shame. He started to speak, to perhaps offer a word of thanks or a command to regain control of the situation. Elena didn't let him. She sat up, wiping the blood and brine from her eyes, and looked at the manhole. The water was no longer geysering. It was draining back into the void. "The intake is closed," she said, her voice a ragged whisper. "Get the DC team down here. Tell them the weld failed at the Fora sea chest, and tell them—" She paused, looking Sterling straight in the eye, her gaze as cold and unyielding as the ocean she had just fought. "Tell them to bring a real mechanic." She stood up, her legs shaking but holding. She didn't wait for a medic. She didn't wait for a commendation. She picked up her wrench, the one she had used to break the seal, and began to walk toward the ladder. The ship was silent now. No engines, no vibration. Just the sound of the Atlantic lapping against the hull, a reminder that the giant was still alive, but only because a woman from Maine had known how to listen to its heart. As she reached the ladder, she felt the ship lurch again, not from a wave, but from a settling, a shift in the ballast. Her eyes widened. The B-flat rhythm hadn't returned. Instead, a new sound began to echo through the frames, a low-frequency groan that came not from the aft, but from the bow. Elena stopped, her hand on the cold steel of the ladder. She closed her eyes and felt the deck. The floor beneath her feet wasn't just wet, it was tilting. The 1MC crackled to life, the voice of the officer of the deck sounding strained, almost breathless. "All hands, this is the bridge. We have a secondary hull breach in the forward magazine. All damage control parties to Delta 6. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." Elena looked back at the manhole she had just escaped. The water she had stopped was only the beginning. The Tallmadge wasn't just leaking. The ship was breaking apart in the middle of the ocean, and the only person who knew why was the woman everyone had dismissed as just a mechanic. She looked at Sketch, who was watching her with a terrified clarity. "Chief," he whispered. "What do we do now?" Elena Vance gripped the wrench until her knuckles turned white. The rage was gone, replaced by the dark, quiet competence of a woman who knew exactly what the night was going to cost her. "Now," she said, "we go to the bow." She climbed the ladder, heading back into the dark, cold heart of the sinking ship, knowing that before the sun came up, she would either be a hero or a ghost at the bottom of the deep water. The climb toward the bow was a journey through a dying city of steel. The Tallmadge didn't just tilt. She labored, a rhythmic, heavy listing to starboard that made every bulkhead feel like it was leaning in to whisper a secret. Elena led the way, her boots finding purchase on the non-skid deck with a certainty that seemed to defy the shifting gravity. Behind her, Sketch was a shadow of heavy breathing and clattering gear, his flashlight beam dancing erratically across the gray-painted pipes of the overhead. They passed through the mess decks, usually a place of fluorescent light and the smell of industrial-grade coffee, now a cavern of emergency red lighting and the frantic sound of chairs sliding against their deck chains. Sailors were scrambling, some half-dressed in their coveralls, their eyes wide and reflecting the crimson strobe of the alarms. No one stopped them. In the chaos of a general quarters call, a chief petty officer moving with purpose was an invisible force of nature. Elena felt the shift in her marrow before they even reached the forward bulkhead of the hangar. It wasn't the water. It wasn't the breach. It was the tension. The ship was hogging. The bow and the stern were being supported by the peaks of the swell, while the midsection, the heavy heart of the ship, was hanging over a trough of empty air. It was the nightmare of every naval architect, the moment where 45,000 tons of American engineering became a bridge with no pilings. She stopped at the heavy steel door of the Frame 40 airlock and pressed her forehead against the cold metal. "Chief!" Sketch panted, stopping behind her. He wiped sweat and salt from his forehead, his charcoal-stained fingers leaving dark streaks across his brow. "Why are we stopping? The 1MC said Delta 6. That's the magazine. We're still 3 decks above it." "Listen, Miller," Elena said, her eyes closed. "I hear the alarms, Chief. I hear the pumps." "No, listen to the frame." She stayed there for a count of 10. Through the steel, she felt the groan. It was a low infrasonic vibration that felt like a toothache in the ship's jaw. It wasn't the chaotic roar of the water she'd fought in the aft void. This was the sound of the spine. The longitudinal girders, the massive I-beams that ran the length of the Tallmadge were reaching their yield point. They were singing a song of molecular exhaustion. "The magazine isn't just breached," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant throb of the emergency generators. "The magazine is the symptom. The keel is flexing. When the hull took that hit from the rogue swell, it didn't just crack a weld. It shifted the load-bearing center. We're not just taking on water, Sketch. We're snapping." "Snapping, you mean? Like in half?" The kid's voice went up an octave, the reality of the Atlantic Ocean pressing in on him from every side suddenly becoming a physical weight. "Not yet," Elena said, pushing off the door and dogging the handle. "But if they keep trying to pump the forward magazine without counterballasting the aft, they're going to put all the stress right on the fracture point. They're following the manual for a flood. They're not following the physics of a structural failure." They stepped through the airlock into the forward peeway. This was officer country, or the edge of it, cleaner, quieter, but now filled with the frantic energy of the damage control DC teams. Men in heavy flash gear, fire-assistant hoods and gloves, were hauling lengths of orange hose toward the magazine access. The air here was colder, smelling of the ozone of overworked electrical motors and the sharp, metallic tang of stressed iron. Elena saw the scene before they even reached the hatch. Lieutenant Commander Sterling was there, his uniform still damp and ruined from the aft void, standing next to the damage control assistant, DCA. A thin, wiry lieutenant named Holloway who looked like he hadn't slept since the ship left Norfolk. They were hunched over a deck plan spread out on a portable table, their flashlights illuminating a mess of blue and red lines. "We have 4 feet of water in the magazine," Holloway was saying, his voice tight. "The sprinklers triggered when the hull breached. The sensors thought it was a fire because of the friction heat. We're trying to isolate the electrical, but if we don't get the pumps ahead of the inflow, we're going to lose the forward stability. The captain wants the magazine dry in 20 minutes or he's going to start jettisoning ordnance." "Jettisoning?" Sterling stammered. "In this sea state, we'll lose half the deck crew." Elena stepped into the circle of light. She didn't wait to be invited. She didn't offer a salute. She just put her hand on the deck plan, her grease-stained finger landing right on frame 32, the forward-most structural junction. "You can't pump it dry," she said. Holloway looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Chief Vance, what are you doing here?" "Sterling said you were," occupied in the aft void. "The aft void is secure," Elena said, her gaze fixed on the map. "But you have a secondary failure. It's not just a breach in the magazine. You have a buckling in the longitudinal stringers between frame 30 and 38. If you pump that magazine dry right now, you're removing the internal pressure that's holding the hull plates in place. The moment that space is empty, the external pressure of the sea is going to collapse the forward hull like a soda can." Holloway blinked, looking from Elena to the map. "Buckling? The sensors don't show any structural deformation. We have a hull breach. We plug the hole, we pump the water." "That's the protocol, Chief. The protocol assumes the ship is structurally sound," Elena said. She looked at Sterling, who was avoiding her eyes, his hands still trembling slightly. "Commander, tell him what happened in Void 4A. Tell him the sensors didn't see the fatigue until the ocean was inside the compartment." Sterling cleared his throat, a pathetic wet sound. She has a point, Holloway. She predicted the aft breach before the alarms went off. By the time I got down there, it was a geyser. Holloway looked back at Elena, the skepticism in his eyes warring with the sheer, unadulterated competence radiating from her. "Even if you're right, Vance, we can't just leave a magazine flooded. We have 2,000 rounds of 5-inch shells and a dozen rolling airframe missiles in there. If they shift or if the salt water corrodes the casings to the point of a cook-off." "I'm not saying leave it," Elena said. "I'm saying you have to stabilize the stress first. You need to flood the aft ballast tanks, specifically 7 Foxtrot and 8 Golf, to pull the stern down and lift the bow. You need to put the ship in a hogging relief. Right now, she's sagging in the middle. You're trying to fix a broken arm by putting a Band-Aid on the finger." "Flood the aft." Holloway shook his head. "We're already low in the water. If I flood the aft, I lose another knot of speed, and we might lose the steering gear if the pressure hits the hydraulic rams. The captain will never authorize it. We're in a combat simulation sea trial, Vance. We're supposed to be showing NAVSEA that this ship can take a hit and keep moving, not that we have to scuttle our own ballast every time a wave hits us." "This isn't a simulation," Elena said, her voice dropping into a register that made the sailors around them stop and look. "The Tallmadge is 20 years old, and she's been ridden hard for every one of them. She's tired, Lieutenant. Her steel is exhausted. If you don't listen to her, she's going to stop being a ship and start being a reef. I'm telling you, I can feel the keel. It's moving. It's moving in ways it's not designed to move." "You feel it," Holloway repeated, the word sounding like an insult. "Vance, I appreciate the hustle, but I'm an engineer. I deal in strain gauges and hydrostatic data. I don't deal in feelings. Get back to your shop. Sterling, keep her under control." Holloway turned back to his team, barking orders for the next wave of DC sailors to enter the magazine. Sterling looked at Elena, a flicker of something that might have been apology in his eyes, but he didn't speak. He followed Holloway, the two of them moving into the maelstrom of the magazine access, leaving Elena and Sketch standing in the dim light of the P-way. Sketch looked at her, his face a mask of uncertainty. "Chief, what do we do? He's the DCA. He's in charge of the ship's skin." Elena didn't answer immediately. She looked at the deck beneath her feet. The tilt had increased. It was subtle, maybe only another degree, but to her it felt like the world was sliding off its axis. She could hear the water now, not the spray from the magazine, but the sound of the Atlantic itself, pressing against the hull just a few feet away. It was a deep, hungry sound. "He's wrong," Elena said. "Chief!" "He's wrong, Miller, And if I let him be wrong, 300 people in the forward berthing are going to die when that magazine collapses. I'm not going back to the shop." She turned and began walking, not toward the magazine, but toward a small, unmarked hatch in the deck near the fire main station. She pulled a universal T-handle wrench from her belt, a tool she'd modified herself, the handle wrapped in paracord, the steel worn smooth by 1,000 turns. "Where are we going?" Sketch asked, scrambling to keep up. "The keel duct," Elena said. "There's a manual override for the ballast manifold in the pump room below the magazine. If I can get to the manifold, I can open the valves for the aft tanks myself. I don't need Holloway's permission to save his ship." "Chief, that's mutiny, or sabotage. They'll court-martial you before the sun comes up." Elena stopped and looked at him. The emergency lighting hit her eyes, making them look like shards of flint. "They can court-martial me at the bottom of the ocean, Miller, or they can do it on the pier in Norfolk. I'd prefer the pier. Are you with me, or are you going to report me?" Sketch looked at her, then at the tattered moleskine poking out of his pocket, the book where he drew the ship's secrets because he wanted to understand them the way she did. He saw the grease on her hands, the blood on her collar, and the absolute terrifying clarity in her gaze. He realized then that he wasn't just following a chief. He was following the only person on the ship who wasn't afraid of the truth. "I'm with you, Chief," he said, his voice cracking but firm. "But I don't think I can turn those valves. I'm not as strong as you." "You don't need to be strong," Elena said, prying open the hatch. "You just need to be fast. If the water breaches the magazine floor, that pump room is going to fill in less than 60 seconds. You're going to stay at the ladder. If you see water coming through the overhead, you yell, and then you run. Do you understand? And you?" Elena didn't answer. She disappeared into the hole. The keel duct was a place that didn't exist in the ship's recruitment brochures. It was a narrow, claustrophobic tunnel of steel that ran along the very bottom of the hull, a space designed for pipes and cables, never for people. The air was dead, heavy with the smell of stagnant water and the bitter tang of anti-corrosive paint. It was barely 3 feet high, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees over the cold, vibrating ribs of the ship. As they moved deeper toward the bow, the sounds of the ship changed. Up in the hangar, the *Tallmadge* was a machine of war. Down here, she was a living thing. The groan Elena had felt through the door was now a physical presence, a shuddering vibration that traveled through her palms and into her chest. The metal was screaming. Every time the ship crested a wave, the duct would twist, the steel plates groaning as they fought to stay together. "Chief," Sketch whispered, his voice echoing in the tight space. "The floor, it's wet." Elena shone her light ahead. A pool of black water was swirling in the bottom of the duct. It wasn't deep, maybe 2 inches, but it was moving, a rhythmic sloshing that matched the tilt of the ship. She reached down and touched it. It was freezing. And it was salty. "It's coming from the seams," she said. "The rivets are weeping. The pressure is forcing the water through the microscopic gaps in the joints." She kept moving, her pace quickening. She knew the layout of the *Tallmadge* better than she knew her own home. She had spent 1,000 hours in spaces like this, tracing lines, tightening bolts, learning the geography of the machine. To her, the ship wasn't a collection of compartments. It was a single, interconnected organism. A failure in the bow was a failure in the stern. A leak in the magazine was a pressure spike in the ballast. They reached the access for Pump Room 1. It was a vertical tube barely wide enough for a human body, descending another 10 feet into the very bowels of the bow. Elena dropped down, her boots splashing into a foot of water at the bottom. The pump room was a cathedral of machinery, massive centrifugal pumps, a forest of color-coded pipes, and a wall of brass-faced gauges that monitored the ship's lifeblood. But the room was in chaos. Water was raining down from the overhead, dripping through the cable runs that led up to the magazine. The emergency lights were flickering, casting long, jerky shadows against the bulkheads. Elena moved to the ballast manifold, a massive bank of valves that looked like the controls of some ancient steam-powered clock. She found the levers for 7 Foxtrot and 8 Golf. They were locked with heavy steel pins, a safety measure to prevent accidental flooding. She took her wrench and began to hammer at the first pin. The sound was a sharp, metallic *clack* that seemed to ring out through the entire ship. "Chief, someone's coming." Sketch's voice drifted down from the duct above. Elena didn't stop. She hit the pin again. It didn't budge. Who is it? I don't know. I see lights in the P-way above the hatch. They must have seen us. Stay there, Elena shouted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She threw her entire weight into the wrench, her muscles bulging under the sweat-soaked fabric of her coveralls. The pin groaned, its surface scarred by the force of her blows. She wasn't thinking about the court-martial. She wasn't thinking about Sterling or Holloway or the captain. She was thinking about the metal. She could feel the Tallmadge leaning, the weight of the Atlantic pushing against the bow, the keel bending like a bowstring drawn too tight. She could hear the rivets popping in the magazine above her, the sound of small, metallic gunshots as the ship's skeleton began to fail. One more hit. The pin sheared off, flying across the room and clattering into the dark water. Elena grabbed the lever and pulled. It was frozen, seized by years of neglect and saltaire corrosion. She braced her feet against the manifold, her spine screaming as she fought the iron. "Come on," she hissed, her teeth bared in a snarl of controlled rage. "Don't you die on me, not today." The lever moved. A low, thundering roar echoed through the pipes, the sound of the Atlantic rushing into the aft ballast tanks. She could feel the vibration of the water, a massive, heavy flow that was already beginning to shift the ship's center of gravity. She moved to the second lever, her hands raw and bleeding, the salt water stinging her wounds. She didn't feel the pain. She felt the ship. The Tallmadge was responding. The sagging stress was beginning to ease as the stern grew heavy, pulling the middle of the ship back into alignment. "Chief." "It's Sterling." Sketch's voice was frantic now. "He's at the hatch. He's telling me to get out of the way." Elena ignored him. She hit the second pin. Clack, clack, crack. It sheared. She grabbed the lever and pulled. "Vance, stop." Sterling was at the top of the access tube, his flashlight beam cutting through the rain of water from the overhead. He looked down, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "What are you doing? You're flooding the aft. Are you insane? You're going to sink us." "I'm saving us, Commander." Elena shouted back, her voice echoing in the confined space. She finally forced the second lever open. The roar of the water doubled in volume. "Look at the clinometer. Look at the pitch. The bow is rising." Sterling looked at a small, wall-mounted gauge near the ladder. The needle, which had been buried in the red, was slowly, agonizingly moving back toward the center. The ship wasn't level, but the catastrophic list was stabilizing. "You had no authority," Sterling stammered, though the anger was being replaced by a terrifying realization. "The captain, the DCA, they're going to have your head for this." "Let them have it," Elena said, stepping back from the manifold, her chest heaving. She was drenched, her hair plastered to her skull, her coveralls heavy with oil and brine. She looked like a ghost that had crawled out of the machine. "But the keel isn't snapping anymore. Tell Holloway he can start his pumps now. The hull can take the pressure." Sterling stayed there for a long moment, looking down at the woman who had just bypassed the entire chain of command of the United States Navy because she heard a sound he couldn't hear. He looked at the water rushing through the pipes, the lifeblood of the ship being redirected by a tin basher with a modified wrench. "Get up here," Sterling said, his voice quiet now, almost defeated. "The captain wants a report on why the ballast alarms are going off. And Vance, God help you if you're wrong about this." "I'm not wrong," she said. She climbed the ladder, Sketch helping her over the lip of the duct. They emerged into the P-way, a bedraggled, salt-stained pair that looked nothing like the disciplined sailors the Navy expected. Holloway was there, holding a radio, his face pale. "The pumps are working," Holloway said, looking at Elena as if she were a ghost. "The inflow has slowed, but the captain is demanding to know who authorized an aft ballast flood. He's beyond furious, Vance. He thinks we're losing the ship." "We were," Elena said, her voice steady. "Now we're just damaged. There's a difference." The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos. Elena was kept in the damage control station, not as a consultant, but as a prisoner of circumstance. She sat on a metal stool, her hands wrapped in a clean rag Sketch had found for her, watching the status boards. The Tallmadge was holding. The forward magazine was being drained, the breech plugged with a temporary, soft patch of wood and rubber. The ship was moving again, though slowly, heading back toward the coast of North Carolina at a cautious 5 knots. The institutional failure, however, was just beginning. At 0500, as the first gray light of a stormy Atlantic morning began to bleed through the portholes, the summons came. Not to the shop, not to the mess, to the bridge. Chief Vance, the master-at-arms, said, his voice devoid of its usual gruffness. The captain wants to see you now. Elena stood up. She didn't fix her hair. She didn't try to scrub the grease from her face. She walked through the ship she had saved, feeling the B-flat rhythm of the engines returning to a steady, if weakened, thrum. She felt the eyes of the crew on her, the whispers, the rumors already spreading about the chief who had gone into the deep water to stop a leak, and then flooded the ship to save the keel. To some, she was a hero. To the system, she was a malfunction. The bridge was a world of hushed voices and expensive glass. Captain Miller, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of Appalachian granite, was standing by the forward windows, his hands clasped behind his back. Sterling and Holloway were there, standing off to the side like schoolboys in the principal's office. "Chief Vance," the captain said, not turning around. "Lieutenant Holloway tells me you saved his magazine. Commander Sterling tells me you saved the aft void. And yet, I have a report on my desk that says you ignored 3 direct orders, broke a half-dozen safety protocols, and took it upon yourself to alter the ballast of a 45,000-ton warship without authorization. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Elena stood at a perfect, rigid attention. Her eyes were fixed on a point on the far bulkhead. "No, sir. The actions I took were necessary to preserve the structural integrity of the hull." "Necessary." The captain turned then, his eyes burning. "I have a board of inquiry being convened in Norfolk the moment we hit the pier. The NAVSEA engineers are going to look at your structural integrity theory, and if they find even a single flaw in your logic, I'm going to make sure you never see the inside of a ship again. You're a mechanic, Chief, not a god. You don't get to decide what happens to my ship." "The ship decided, sir," Elena said, her voice like ice. "I just listened." The captain stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. The silence on the bridge was absolute, the only sound the rhythmic click of the radar sweep. Elena didn't blink, she didn't beg. She stood there with the weight of the night on her shoulders, accepting the cost of being right. "You're relieved of all duties, Vance," the captain said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You will remain in your berthing until we reach Norfolk. If you so much as touch a wrench, I'll have you in the brig in irons. Am I clear?" "Yes, sir," Elena said. She turned and walked off the bridge, her head held high. She didn't look at Sterling. She didn't look at Holloway. She walked down the ladder wells, heading toward the dark, cramped world of the chief's berthing. But as she reached the hangar deck, she stopped. The B-flat rhythm was gone. It wasn't a grind this time. It wasn't a moan. It was a silence. A sudden, terrifying absence of sound that lasted for exactly 3 seconds. And then the ship didn't just vibrate. She jumped. A massive, thundering explosion rocked the Tallmadge asterisk, throwing Elena against the bulkhead. The sound came from the midships near the engine room. Smoke began to pour out of the ventilation ducts, thick and black and smelling of burning oil and electrical fire. The 1MC didn't even have time to activate before the ship began to groan again, but this time it was the sound of a scream. Elena scrambled to her feet, her ears ringing, her vision blurred. She looked through the hangar toward the engine room access. A group of sailors was running toward her, their faces masks of terror. "The boilers!" one of them screamed. "The main header just blew." Elena didn't run. She stood her ground, her hand finding the cold steel of a support pillar. She closed her eyes, trying to find the frequency. But the ship wasn't singing anymore. She was dying. The explosion hadn't just been a boiler. It was the final, catastrophic failure of the stressed keel, the spine finally snapping under the pressure of the sea and the internal heat of the engines. She felt the deck tilt, not 1 degree, not 2, but a sudden, violent plunge to 10 degrees, then 15. The Tallmadge asterisk was rolling. "Chief!" It was Sketch. He had been following her, staying at a distance, and now he was crawling toward her across the slanting deck, his face streaked with tears and soot. "Chief, we have to get out. The engine room is gone. The water is coming in through the main shaft." Elena looked at the hangar deck where the multi-million-dollar Harriers were beginning to strain against their tie-down chains. She looked at the smoke, at the red lights, at the chaos of a ship that had finally been pushed too far. She knew then. The deep water wasn't just a place she had gone to fix a leak. It was where the ship was going now, and she was the only one who knew how to stop the roll if it could be stopped at all. But to do it, she would have to go back down. She would have to go into the fire. "Sketch," Elena said, her voice cutting through his panic, as calm as a winter morning in Maine. Get to the lifeboats. Tell the bridge to abandon ship. Tell them the keel is gone. What about you? Elena looked toward the smoke-filled hatch that led to the engine room. She felt the wrench in her belt, the one tool that hadn't failed her. I'm going to stay with the giant, she said. She didn't wait for his answer. She turned and ran into the smoke, a lone figure disappearing into the heart of the disaster, moving not toward safety, but toward the very center of the scream. Deep in the belly of the ship, the water was already chest-high in the engine room, a swirling, oily vortex of heat and death. Elena reached the primary steam valve, the only thing that could prevent the remaining boilers from turning the Tallmadge into a pressurized bomb. The valve was surrounded by a cloud of live, invisible steam, a wall of heat that could strip the skin from her bones in seconds. She stood at the edge of the heat, the roar of the dying ship in her ears, and for the first time in her life, Elena Vance felt a flicker of real, primal fear. Not for her career, not for her reputation, but for the fact that she might be the only one who knew how to die with the ship. She took a breath of the scorched air, gripped her wrench, and stepped into the white-hot mist. The scream of the metal was the last thing she heard before the world turned to fire. The steam wasn't white. That was the first thing they taught you in A school, and the first thing you forgot when the world started ending in a cloud of scalding vapor. High-pressure steam, the kind that lived inside the Tallmadge's Maine headers at 600 pounds per square inch, was a transparent, invisible killer. It didn't look like a tea kettle. It looked like nothing at all until it hit the air and turned into a shimmering distortion that could slice through a man's arm like a wire through warm butter. Elena Vance stood at the threshold of the lower engine room and didn't see a disaster. She saw a frequency. The air in front of her was screaming, a high, glass-shattering pitch that lived at the very edge of human hearing. It was the sound of the ship's lifeblood escaping through a jagged fracture in the No. 2 boiler's main feed line. She didn't have a broomstick to find the leak. She didn't have a thermal imager. She had a rag-wrapped wrench, and the memory of the ship's blueprints burned into the back of her retinas. She took a step forward, her boots hitting the water that was already 6 inches deep on the deck plates. The water was hot, soaking through the leather, but she ignored the stinging. She was counting the beats. The Tallmadge was listing 19 degrees to starboard now, a heavy, drunken lean that made the bulkheads feel like they were closing in. In her mind, she could see the 3D model of the hull, the red lines of stress radiating from the snapped keel and meeting the blue lines of the internal pressure. The ship wasn't just sinking. She was tearing herself apart from the inside out, the thermal expansion of the escaping steam fighting the cold, crushing weight of the Atlantic. "Chief!" The voice was weak, buried under the roar of the atmospheric exhaust. Elena turned her head, squinting through the gathering white mist as the steam began to cool and become visible. Near the primary reduction gear, a figure was pinned. It was Ensign Taylor, the 23-year-old kid from Annapolis who had spent the last 3 months trying to prove he was more than just a gold bar and a clean haircut. He was lying on his side, his left leg caught beneath a heavy steel equipment locker that had sheared its mounting bolts when the ship jumped. The locker was massive, 300 pounds of tools and spare parts, and it was slowly sliding further down the slant of the deck, pinning him against the vibrating casing of the turbine. Elena moved. She didn't run. Running was how you died in a flooded compartment. She navigated the slanted deck with the precision of a mountain climber, her center of gravity low, her eyes scanning the air for that telltale shimmer of invisible steam. She reached Taylor just as a fresh burst of vapor erupted from an overhead pipe, the heat blooming against her face like a physical blow. She felt the skin on her cheek tighten, the beginnings of a flash burn, but she didn't flinch. She dropped to her knees in the oily water beside him. "Don't move, Taylor," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the panic that was clearly radiating from the boy's wide, glassy eyes. "If you struggle, you're going to tear the femoral artery. Stay still." "Chief." The steam, Taylor wheezed. He was pale, the color of wet chalk, and his breath was coming in short, ragged hitches. "The header. It's going to blow." "I heard the safety valves pop, but they're not holding. The pressure is still climbing." "I know," Elena said. She looked at the locker. There was no way to lift it alone, not at this angle, not with the ship bucking like a dying animal. She looked at the turbine casing next to him. It was hot, hot enough to cook the meat on his ribs if he touched it, but it was solid. She needed a lever. She looked around the debris-strewn deck and saw a 4-foot length of heavy-gauge pipe that had been shaken loose from the lagging. She grabbed the pipe, her hands slick with a mixture of seawater and hydraulic fluid. She jammed the end of the pipe under the locker, using the turbine casing as a fulcrum. She braced her feet against a deck cleat and pulled. The muscles in her back screamed, a sharp, white-hot pain that flared from her spine to her shoulders. The locker didn't move. "Chief, just go," Taylor whispered. A tear tracked through the soot on his face. "The captain," he said, "abandoned ship. I heard it on the internal." "The captain is on the bridge," Elena said, her teeth bared as she put her entire weight into the lever. "I'm in the engine room. My ship, my rules, now. When I say pull, you slide your leg out. You understand me, Ensign? You don't think about the pain, you don't think about the bone, you just move." She closed her eyes. She stopped listening to the roar and started listening to the ship. She felt the Tallmadge lift on the swell of a massive wave, the momentary weightlessness of the midships as the bow and stern were supported by the water. For half a second, the gravity shifted. The pressure on the locker eased by a fraction of a percent. "Now!" she roared. She heaved. The pipe groaned, bending under the stress. The locker shifted 2 inches. Taylor let out a sound that wasn't human, a high, thin wail of pure agony, but he moved. He dragged his mangled leg clear of the steel just as the ship slammed back down into the trough of the wave. The locker crashed back into place, the sound of the impact echoing like a cannon shot through the compartment. Elena dropped the pipe and grabbed Taylor by the collar of his life vest. She dragged him 3 feet back, away from the heat of the turbine, her breath coming in heavy, burning gasps. She looked at his leg. It was bad. The bone was visible through the shredded fabric of his coveralls, but the blood wasn't pulsing. The artery was intact. "Stay here," she said, leaning close to his ear. "If the water reaches your chin, you hold your breath. I'm going to the main header." "You can't," Taylor gasped, clutching at her sleeve. "The steam, it's right in the way. You'll be cooked alive before you reach the wheel." Elena looked toward the back of the engine room. The main steam isolation valve was a massive iron wheel, 4 feet in diameter, located on a platform 10 feet above the deck. To reach it, she had to cross the path of the primary leak. The invisible steam was venting directly across the ladder well. It was a kill zone. "I'm not going to be cooked," Elena said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm register. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy roll of duct tape and a spare piece of fire-retardant cloth. She began to wrap her right arm and hand, layer after layer, creating a crude, thick gauntlet. "I'm going to be fast." She stood up and turned away from him. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford the luxury of empathy right now. She had to become the machine. As she approached the ladder well, the heat became an entity. It was a wall of vibrating energy that pushed against her chest, trying to stop her heart. The air was shimmering so violently now that the steel stairs looked like they were melting. She knew the frequency of the leak. It was a jagged, discordant C-sharp that cut through the B-flat hum of the remaining generators. She could feel the vibration in her teeth. She took a breath, one last breath of air that wasn't pure fire and charged. She didn't use her eyes, she used her sight. In the darkness of her mind's eye, she saw the jet of steam as a solid pillar of white-hot glass. She saw the gaps in the turbulence, the microseconds where the pressure fluctuated as the boiler gasped for water. She moved in a jagged, rhythmic pattern, her body twisting to avoid the areas where the shimmer was most intense. She hit the ladder and climbed, the metal burning through her gloves, her coveralls smoking. A stray tongue of steam licked across her shoulder. Elena didn't scream. She didn't have the air for it. The pain was a sudden, blinding flash of white that scorched the nerves and left her arm feeling like it had been dipped in molten lead. She kept climbing. 1 step, 2, 3. She reached the platform and threw herself toward the isolation wheel. The wheel was seized. Of course it was. The Tallmadge was a ship of secrets and neglected maintenance, a veteran of a dozen deployments where good enough had been the standard for the Black Gang. The salt air and the heat had fused the brass threads of the valve stem. Elena grabbed the wheel with her gauntleted hand and her bare left hand. The metal was 300 degrees. She felt the skin on her left palm blister instantly, the smell of her own burning flesh filling the small space behind her goggles. She didn't let go. She braced her boots against the railing and hauled. Asterisk move, you son of a bitch. Asterisk the wheel didn't budge. The steam roar intensified. Below her, the water was rising faster now, the ship's list reaching 24 degrees. She could hear the hogging sound again. The keel was crying out, the structural failure in the midships widening as the weight of the water in the engine room pulled the hull down. If she didn't close this valve, the boilers would explode, the ship would break in two, and 300 men would be sucked into the Atlantic before they could even reach the life rafts. She felt the ship's frequency shift again. A deep, low-frequency thrumming began to resonate through the platform. It was the sound of the main shaft vibrating in its housing, the death rattle of the propulsion system. Elena closed her eyes. She stopped fighting the wheel and started listening to it. She felt the molecular tension in the brass. She felt the way the heat had expanded the metal, locking the threads together. She needed a counter-frequency. She needed to hit it at the exact moment the ship's own vibration hit the resonant frequency of the valve stem. She waited. The heat was melting the plastic of her goggles. Her lungs were beginning to blister from the ambient steam. Asterisk there. Asterisk the vibration hit her feet, a sharp, rhythmic shudder that traveled up her legs and into her spine. It was the crack she had felt earlier, the sound of a structural girder failing 3 decks down. She twisted. The wheel moved. It was an agonizing, grinding inch, but it moved. She didn't stop. She threw her entire body into the rotation, her burned hands slick with blood and fluid, her vision narrowing until the only thing in the world was the iron circle in front of her. Asterisk 10 turns, 20, 30. Asterisk the roar of the steam began to change. The high-pitched scream dropped to a hiss, then a low, guttering moan. The pressure gauges on the bulkhead, the ones that hadn't shattered, began to needle down. The invisible killer was being choked off at the source. Elena didn't wait for the final turn. She knew the valve was seated by the feel of the resistance. She let go of the wheel and collapsed onto the platform, her chest heaving, her burned hands trembling so violently they looked like they belonged to someone else. She stayed there for a count of 5, the silence of the engine room, a relative silence, filled with the sound of rushing water and the groans of the hull settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had done it. The boilers were isolated. The asterisk Tallmadge asterisk wasn't going to explode, but she was still sinking. Elena rolled onto her stomach and looked over the edge of the platform. The water was now waist-deep on the lower level. Ensign Taylor was clinging to a pipe, his head barely above the oily surface, his eyes fixed on the ladder. He had waited. He hadn't drowned. "Taylor," she shouted, her voice a shredded rasp. "The ladder, get to the ladder." I can't swim, Chief." The boy yelled back, his voice thin with terror. "My leg, it's dead weight." Elena didn't think. She didn't calculate the risk. She swung her legs over the railing and dropped. She hit the water with a splash that sent a plume of oily brine into the air. The cold was a shock, a sudden, brutal contrast to the fire on the platform that sent her heart into a frantic, uneven rhythm. She surfaced and struck out for Taylor, her burned arm trailing in the water like a broken wing. The pain was gone now, replaced by a dull, throbbing numbness that she knew was the sign of third-degree damage. She didn't care. The numbness was a tool. She reached Taylor just as the ship took another heavy roll to starboard. A wall of water washed over them, a dark, suffocating wave that tasted of salt and diesel. Elena grabbed Taylor's life vest and pulled him upward, her feet searching for purchase on the submerged machinery. "I've got you," she hissed, her face inches from his. "We're going up, one hand at a time, do you hear me? One hand." They reached the ladder. Elena became the foundation. She stayed below him, her shoulder acting as a step for his good leg, her one working hand shoving him upward with a strength that felt like it was being drawn from the very marrow of her bones. She didn't feel the heat anymore. She didn't feel the cold. She was just a mechanism of survival, a biological pump moving a piece of cargo toward the light. They reached the upper hatch, the emergency red lighting casting a hellish glow over the scene. 2 sailors from the DC team were there, their faces masks of shock as they saw the chief and the ensign emerge from the darkness of the flooded hold. They grabbed Taylor and hauled him through the hatch, laying him on the relatively dry deck of the Peeway. Elena climbed out last. She didn't wait for a hand. She hauled herself over the coaming and collapsed against the bulkhead, her breath coming in long, shuddering sobs. She looked at her hands. The skin was gone from her left palm, the raw meat of her muscles exposed to the air. Her right arm was a mosaic of white and red blisters. "Chief, oh my God, Chief," one of the sailors whispered, reaching for a first aid kit. "Don't," Elena said, her voice a ghost of itself. "Check the ensign, get him to the flight deck, the lifeboats." "The order was canceled, Chief," the sailor said, his hands shaking as he started to wrap Taylor's leg. "The captain, he says the list has stabilized. We're not abandoning, whatever you did down there. The DCA says the ship is holding. The pumps are catching up." Elena closed her eyes. She leaned her head back against the cold steel of the bulkhead and let out a single, jagged laugh. It wasn't a sound of joy. It was the sound of a woman who had just realized she was going to have to live with everything she had done. The immediate aftermath was a blur of voices and movement. They put her on a stretcher, even though she tried to fight them. They carried her up through the winding corridors of the ship, corridors that were no longer slanted at a suicidal angle, but still felt wrong, still felt like they were vibrating with the memory of the snap. She saw Sketch as they passed the hangar deck. He was standing by a stack of life vests, his charcoal-stained face streaked with tears. When he saw her, he didn't say a word. He just stood at a rigid, perfect attention, his hand coming up in a salute that was the most authentic thing Elena had ever seen in the Navy. She didn't salute back. She couldn't. Her hands were wrapped in thick white bandages that made her look like she was wearing boxing gloves. She just nodded, a tiny, infinitesimal movement of her chin, and then the sailors were carrying her past him, heading toward the makeshift infirmary in the wardroom. The wardroom was a scene from a nightmare. The long mahogany tables, where the officers usually ate their meals on white linen, were now covered in plastic sheeting and blood. Men were moaning, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and burnt hair. Elena was placed on a corner table, her stretcher rattling as the ship hit a rogue wave. She lay there, staring at the overhead, listening. The *Tallmadge* was different now. The B-flat hum was gone, replaced by a low, rhythmic thudding, the sound of the emergency diesel generators working at their limit. The ship felt heavier, more sluggish, like a wounded whale trying to find the surface. But the singing of the metal had stopped. The stress had been redistributed. The hogging had been relieved by the flood she had authorized, and the internal pressure had been vented by the valve she had closed. She had saved the ship, and in doing so, she had destroyed herself. She knew how the institution worked. She had been a part of it for 15 years. They would look at the data. They would see the unauthorized ballast change. They would see the damage to the steam header. They would see the injuries to Ensign Taylor, and they would look for a reason. They wouldn't look for the listening. They wouldn't look for the feel of the keel. They would look for the rules she had broken. A shadow fell over her. She didn't have to open her eyes to know who it was. The scent of expensive cologne and fear followed Lieutenant Commander Sterling like a shroud. He stood over her, his uniform finally dry, his hair combed back into a semblance of order. He looked down at her, and for the first time, Elena saw something other than arrogance in his eyes. He looked afraid. "The captain is coming down," Sterling whispered. He's talking to the admiral on the satellite link. They're calling it a miraculous recovery of the ship's stability." Elena didn't answer. She just watched the way the light reflected off the brass buttons on his chest. "I told them you were acting under my direction," Sterling said, his voice dropping even lower. "In the pump room. I told them I authorized the ballast flood as an emergency measure." Elena turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto his. "Why?" Sterling looked away, his jaw tightening. "Because if I didn't, they'd have you in the brig. And if they had you in the brig, they'd have to explain how a chief petty officer knew more about the ship's structural integrity than the damage control assistant and the executive officer combined. It's better for everyone if it was an official decision." "You're a liar, Commander," Elena said, her voice a dry rattle. "I'm a survivor, Vance," he snapped, his eyes flashing with a brief return of his old self. "Just like you, the Navy doesn't like miracles. They like procedures. I gave them a procedure. You gave them a ship. We're even." He walked away before she could respond, his boots clicking on the linoleum floor. Elena lay there, the weight of the lie settling on her chest. She had saved the ship, but the story of how she had done it was already being rewritten, polished, and filed away into a report that would make sense to a board of inquiry. The extraordinary capability she possessed, the thing that made her who she was was once again being pushed back into the shadows, hidden behind the rank and the bureaucracy she had tried to circumvent. The pain began to return then, a deep, throbbing ache that pulsed in time with the ship's engines. She felt the tears welling up in her eyes, not from the burns, but from the sheer, exhausting loneliness of being right in a world that only valued being authorized. The door to the wardroom opened and the air changed. The voices of the other sailors dropped to a whisper. Captain Miller entered. He didn't look like granite anymore. He looked like an old man who had been through a war. He walked past the other stretchers, his eyes fixed on the corner where Elena lay. He stopped at the foot of her table. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked at her, at the bandages, at the soot-stained face, at the eyes that refused to blink. He looked at the woman who had defied him, who had broken his rules, and who had kept his command from becoming a mass grave. "Chief Vance," the captain said. Elena tried to sit up, her muscles screaming in protest. "Stay down," Miller said, his hand coming up to stop her. It was the first time he had ever spoken to her without a rank in his voice. "I just came from the engine room. I saw the isolation valve. I saw the equipment locker you moved." He paused, his throat working. "The engineers say it's impossible," the captain continued, his voice quiet. "They say the valve was seized too tight for a human being to turn. They say the steam leak should have killed anyone who got within 10 feet of that platform. They are calling it an anomaly of the pressure drop." Elena looked at him, her gaze unflinching. "It wasn't an anomaly, sir." "I know," Miller said. He leaned in closer, his voice a whisper that only she could hear. "I know it wasn't. I've been on this ship for 3 years, Vance. I've walked these decks every night. I've felt the same things you feel. I just didn't have the courage to trust it. I trusted the gauges instead." He reached out and touched the edge of her stretcher, his fingers grazing the metal. "The inquiry is still going to happen," he said. "Sterling's little story, it won't hold up under the telemetry. They'll know you acted alone. They'll know you bypassed the chain of command." "I know," Elena said, "but they'll also know that I'm the one who didn't stop you," Miller said, a grim smile touching his lips. "When I saw you going into that duct, I could have sent the MAAs after you. I didn't. I let you go because, deep down, I knew you were the only one who was actually listening to the Tallmadge asterisk." He stood up straight then, his face hardening back into the mask of a captain. "Get some rest, Chief. We'll be in Norfolk in 12 hours. The pier is going to be full of brass, and every one of them is going to want to know how my ship survived a keel snap in a force 8 gale." "What will you tell them, sir?" Elena asked. The captain looked toward the door where the gray morning light was finally starting to break through the clouds. "I'll tell them the truth," he said. "I'll tell them I have a chief who knows things that aren't in the manuals, and then I'll tell them to stay the hell out of her way." He turned and walked out, his stride heavy but certain. Elena closed her eyes. The ship groaned, a soft, settling sound like a tired person sinking into a chair. The B-flat was gone, replaced by a new sound, a complex, layered harmony of repaired steel and tired hearts. It wasn't perfect. It was scarred. It was broken in places that would never fully heal. But it was alive. She drifted into a shallow, pain-filled sleep, her mind wandering back to the deep water, the place where the ship's secrets lived, where the pressure was absolute and the truth was the only thing that didn't break. She felt the wrench in her hand again, felt the heat of the steam, felt the moment the world turned to fire. She wasn't afraid anymore. Outside, the Atlantic continued to churn, the massive swells of the storm slowly beginning to subside. The Tallmadge asterisk moved through the water, a limping, blackened ghost of a ship, her bow pointed toward the horizon. In the forward berthing, 300 men slept, their lives preserved by a woman they would never truly understand. In the engine room, the water began to recede, leaving behind a coat of oil and salt on the dead machinery. The reckoning was coming. The lawyers, the engineers, the admirals, they were all waiting on the pier, ready to dissect the night and find someone to blame. They would bring their charts and their graphs and their legal precedents. They would try to turn the miracle into a malfunction. But as the sun finally rose over the Virginia coast, casting a long, golden light across the battered hull of the Tallmadge asterisk, Elena Vance felt the ship's heartbeat beneath her. It was steady. It was strong, and for the first time in 15 years, it was in tune with her own. She was still standing. Barely. But standing. The crisis had passed, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. It was the sound of a woman who had finally found her voice, not in words, but in the cold, hard reality of the metal she had saved. She lay there in the wardroom, a prisoner of her own competence, watching the shadows of the sailors move against the bulkhead. She knew the cost. She could feel it in her hands, in her lungs, in the uncertain future that lay ahead of her. But as she listened to the rhythmic thrum of the emergency generators, she knew she would do it all again, because the ship was more than steel and steam. The ship was a promise, and Elena Vance was the only one who knew how to keep it. She waited for the pier. She waited for the questions. She waited for the end of the story she had been writing since the day she first touched a wrench. But deep inside, where the frequencies lived, she knew the story was just beginning. The giant was still breathing, and so was she. The hospital room at Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth, smelled of lemon-scented bleach and the specific metallic tang of the silver sulfadiazine cream they smeared onto Elena's raw palms twice a day. Outside the window, the Virginia humidity was already thickening into a gray haze, and the distant, rhythmic thud of a helicopter heading toward NAS Oceana vibrated in the glass. Elena didn't look at the window. She didn't look at her hands, which were wrapped in thick, white gauze and elevated on pillows like sacrificial offerings. She looked at the television bolted to the wall, which was turned off, reflecting a dark, warped version of the room. In that reflection, she saw the ghost of the *Tallmadge*. She could still feel the ship's list in her inner ear, a phantom gravity that made the stationary hospital bed feel like it was pitching at 19 degrees. She had been in the burn unit for 6 days. For 6 days, the silence of the hospital had been the loudest thing she had ever encountered. In the engine room, even in the middle of a catastrophe, there was a logic to the noise. There was a sequence. Here, there was only the erratic beep of the morphine pump and the soft, squeaking rubber soles of the nurses. They treated her with a hushed, reverent distance, as if she were made of thin glass. They had seen the charts. They knew she had stayed in a space where the ambient temperature had spiked to 400 degrees. They knew she had used her bare hands to turn a brass wheel that had been heated into a branding iron. They saw a hero. Elena just felt the silence where the ship's heartbeat used to be. The first shift in the world happened on the 7th morning. It wasn't a doctor who walked in, but a man in a charcoal suit with a Navy JAG insignia on his lapel. He carried a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than Elena's first car. He didn't sit down. He stood at the foot of her bed, checking his watch, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He was the vanguard of the institution. The *Tallmadge* was currently sitting at Pier 12, a blackened, broken monument to a disaster that shouldn't have been survived, and the Navy was finally beginning to move its massive, bureaucratic limbs. "Chief Vance," the man said. His voice was clipped, the accent of a man who had gone to school in New England and spent his career in windowless rooms in D.C. "I'm Commander Aris. I've been assigned to the preliminary Jagman investigation into the grounding and subsequent engineering casualty of the *Tallmadge*. I'm here to inform you that your statement will be required by the Board of Inquiry 48 hours from now. You have the right to counsel, though at this stage you are being called as a key witness, not a subject." Elena didn't blink. The morphine made the edges of the room fuzzy, but her mind was a cold, clear lake. "Who is the subject, Commander?" Aris tightened his grip on his briefcase. "The investigation is broad, Chief. We're looking at the structural failure of the hull, the navigational errors that led to the grounding, and the unconventional response of the engineering department. There are questions about the chain of command during the final 2 hours of the storm." The gap opened then. Elena felt it, a cold draft in the room that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. They weren't just looking for the truth. They were looking for the how. The Navy loved a miracle until they had to write it down in a report. Once it was on paper, a miracle looked like a deviation from protocol. It looked like a liability. "Commander Sterling says he authorized the ballast flood," Elena said, her voice a dry rasp. Aris paused. A flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, crossed his face. "Lieutenant Commander Sterling's statement is being reviewed alongside the telemetry from the ship's internal sensors. There are discrepancies, Chief. The timing of the flood doesn't match the recorded orders on the bridge, nor does the manual isolation of the number 2 boiler. The engineers from NAVSEA have been on board for 3 days. They say the valve you closed shouldn't have been movable by a single person. They're saying it took a 3-foot pipe wrench and 2 men to crack it back open once the metal cooled. He looked at her hands then, really looked at them. The weight of the silence returned. "The board wants to know how you did it," Aris whispered, stepping closer. "They want to know why you were in that space when the order was to evacuate, and they want to know why the ship's stability stabilized 4 minutes before the official order was logged. It's a matter of record, Vance. If the record is wrong, someone is responsible for the lie." He left as quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind a business card and a sense of impending weight. Elena closed her eyes and tried to find the frequency. She tried to listen to the hospital, to the hum of the wiring in the walls, to the vibration of the elevators. But there was nothing. The scar tissue on her hands felt like lead. The sensory bridge she had spent 15 years building, the one that allowed her to feel the stress in a steel girder or the cavitation in a pump, was gone. She was just a woman in a bed, wrapped in gauze, waiting for the machinery of the law to grind her into a shape that fit their narrative. That afternoon, Sketch arrived. He didn't have a pass, but he was wearing his dress whites, and he had the kind of stubborn, lower-enlisted stare that could burn through a locked door. He looked smaller without the soot on his face, his hair cut into a fresh, jagged high-end tight. He was carrying a plastic bag from a gas station and a small, grease-stained notebook. He sat in the chair by the bed and didn't say a word for 5 minutes. He just looked at Elena's bandaged hands, his jaw working. "They're stripping her," Sketch finally said. His voice was thick. "The Tallmadge asterisk. They've got the yellow tape all over the hangar deck." Men in white coveralls with sensors. They're cutting into the bulkheads to see the stress fractures. It's like an autopsy, Chief. They're treating her like she's already dead. "She's not dead," Elena said. "She's at the pier." "She's a crime scene," Sketch spat. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Sterling is talking to everyone. He's walking around the pier like he's the one who pulled the sword from the stone, but the guys in the black gang, we know, we saw you go into that duct. We saw the way the water changed. And Taylor, he's in the ward down the hall. He told the investigators that you moved a 300-pound locker with a piece of scrap pipe. They told him he was hallucinating from the shock." He pulled the notebook out of the bag. It was the charcoal sketch he had been working on the night of the storm. He had finished it. It showed Elena standing at the threshold of the pump room, her silhouette framed by the white mist of the steam. She looked like a shadow, something ancient and primal, her hand pressed against the bulkhead as if she were whispering to the ship. "I gave them my statement," Sketch said. "I told them exactly what I saw. I told them you heard the hull snap before the sensors did. The JAG officer. He just looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. He asked me if I had been getting enough sleep. He asked me if you had a history of intuitive behavior that interfered with standard operating procedures." "Sketch," Elena said, her voice a warning. "No, Chief, you don't get it. They aren't trying to reward you. They're trying to categorize you. If you're a hero, then Sterling is a liar, and the captain is incompetent for losing control of his engine room. But if you're unstable, if you're a rogue element who got lucky, then the institution is safe. They can blame the grounding on the storm and the recovery on a fluke. They want the fluke, Chief. They don't want the truth." He laid the notebook on her tray table. "I'm not letting them do it. The guys, we're all signing a letter, every man who was in that engine room. We're telling them that if you go down, we all go down. We're telling them the Tallmadge asterisk is still afloat because of you." "You'll lose your stripe," Elena said. "They'll call it a conspiracy. They'll say I influenced you." "Let them," Sketch said. He stood up, his eyes hard and bright. "I'd rather be a seaman recruit who told the truth than a petty officer who watched his chief get buried by a man in a clean uniform. You saved us, Elena, not the Navy, you." He left before she could argue, his boots echoing with a defiant rhythm. Elena looked at the drawing. In the charcoal lines, she saw herself through someone else's eyes. She didn't see a chief. She saw a woman who was part of the ship, a ghost in the machine. It was a beautiful, dangerous image. It was exactly the kind of thing that would scare a board of admirals to death. The following day, the cost of her actions arrived in the form of a physical therapy session. They had to take the bandages off. The nurse, a woman named Sarah who had seen 3 deployments worth of casualties, didn't make eye contact as she unwound the gauze. Elena watched the white fabric fall away, layer by layer, until the raw reality of her hands was exposed to the sterile air. Her left palm was a landscape of pink and white scar tissue, the skin pulled tight and shiny. Her right arm, from the wrist to the elbow, was a mottled mosaic of graft sites and deep, angry burns. It didn't look like her arm. It looked like a piece of industrial equipment that had been left in the rain. "Try to close your hand," Sarah said softly. Elena tried. She sent the command from her brain, the same command she had sent 1,000 times to grip a wrench or a railing. Her fingers twitched. They moved perhaps half an inch before a sharp, electric spike of pain shot up her arm, followed by a dull, dead resistance. The tendons were tight, the nerves screaming at the sudden tension. "Again," Sarah urged. Elena gritted her teeth. She pushed. The room narrowed. She could smell the antiseptic, the faint scent of her own healing flesh, the ozone of the medical equipment. She pushed until her vision swam, until a single bead of sweat rolled down her temple. Her hand didn't close. It remained a stiff, useless claw. The realization hit her then, heavier than the locker that had pinned Taylor. Her capability, her sight, had always been tied to her hands. She heard through her skin. She felt the vibrations of the world through the sensitive nerves in her fingertips. Those nerves were gone. They had been cooked in the steam of the Tallmadge asterisk. She had traded the very thing that made her extraordinary to save a ship, that was now being used as a weapon against her. "It will take time," Sarah said, her voice practiced and gentle. "The nerves need to regrow, the skin needs to stretch. You're lucky you kept the hand at all, Chief." "I don't feel the table," Elena said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but her heart was racing. She pressed her palm against the cold metal of the bedside tray. Nothing, no vibration, no temperature. Just a vague, distant pressure, like she was wearing a thick leather glove. "I can't feel the metal. That's normal for 3rd degree." "It's not normal for me," Elena interrupted. She looked at the nurse, and for the first time, Sarah flinched. There was a cold, controlled rage in Elena's eyes, a rage born of the silence. "I need to feel the metal." The nurse stepped back, adjusting her clipboard. "I'll get the doctor. We can adjust your pain meds." Elena didn't want meds. She wanted the frequency back. She sat there, staring at her ruined hands, and realized the Navy didn't have to break her. She had already broken herself. She had reached into the fire to pull out the ship, and the fire had taken her sight as payment. She was now exactly what the institution wanted her to be, an ordinary woman. A disabled sailor, a line item on a medical discharge form. The shift in the institutional response became undeniable that evening when Lieutenant Commander Sterling appeared in her doorway. He wasn't wearing his suit this time. He was in his service khakis, his ribbons perfectly aligned, his face pale and drawn. He didn't come in. He leaned against the door frame, looking out into the hallway as if he were being followed. "The board is asking about the pump room," Sterling said. He didn't look at her. "They found the scrap pipe, Vance. They found the marks on the turbine casing where you used it as a fulcrum. They know a woman of your stature couldn't have moved that locker alone, not unless the laws of physics took a day off." "Maybe the laws of physics aren't as rigid as you think, Commander," Elena said. Sterling let out a short, bitter laugh. "The Navy thinks they are rigid. They're asking me about the authorization. They want to know why I wasn't in the space if I was the one who ordered the flood. They're starting to see the holes in the story. They're starting to see that I was on the ladder and you were in the water." He finally looked at her, and Elena saw the reckoning. It wasn't a moment of growth. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. Sterling had spent his entire life climbing a ladder made of paper and prestige, and he had finally realized that the ladder was on fire. "They're going to offer you a deal," Sterling whispered. "They're going to offer to let you retire with full benefits, a medical discharge, a hero's exit. All you have to do is sign a statement saying that the events of that night were confused, that the orders were given even if they weren't heard correctly, that I was in command of the engineering response." "You want me to help you lie," Elena said. "I want us both to survive," Sterling snapped. "If you tell them what really happened, if you tell them you acted on instinct and that I was paralyzed on that ladder, they'll crucify us both. They'll take your pension, Vance. They'll say you were a danger to the crew. They'll say your extraordinary capability is a psychological delusion that led to a series of unauthorized, high-risk gambles. They'll turn your miracle into a court-martial." He stepped into the room, his voice urgent. "Think about it. You can't even close your hand. What are you going to do? Go back to the fleet?" "You're done, Elena. You're a broken tool. Take the deal. Let me keep my career and you get to keep your pride. Nobody has to know what happened in the dark." Elena looked at him, really looked at the man who had dismissed her, who had tried to sideline her, and who was now begging her to save him one more time. She felt a flicker of the old frequency, a tiny, vibrating spark of the woman who had stood on that platform in the steam. "I already know what happened in the dark, Commander," she said. "And so do you. That's the difference between us. I can live with it. You're the one who's screaming inside." Sterling's face hardened. The fear turned into something colder, something more dangerous. "The board meets at 0900 tomorrow. The captain is testifying first. Then me, then you, if you don't take the deal, Vance. I won't be the only one who loses everything. The Navy is a machine. It doesn't like parts it can't explain, and right now you're the most unexplained part on this ship." He walked out, and the silence he left behind was different. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, the silence of a tomb. The weight of the institution continued to settle over the next 12 hours. Captain Miller arrived late that night. He looked 10 years older than he had on the flight deck. He sat in the chair Sketch had occupied, his hands clasped between his knees. He didn't look like a captain. He looked like a man who had lost his home. "The Tallmadge is being decommissioned," Miller said quietly. "The damage to the keel is too extensive. The cost of the refit is more than the hull is worth. They're going to tow her to the yard in Philadelphia. She'll be scrapped by the end of the year." Elena felt a sharp, physical pang in her chest, a phantom pain that mirrored the snap of the ship's spine. "She's a good ship, sir." "She was a good ship," Miller corrected. "But she was an old ship, and old ships have secrets. The investigators, they're looking for someone to blame for the grounding. They're looking at the navigator, the OOD, and they're looking at me. But they are also looking at the anomaly of the recovery. They can't explain how the ship stayed together long enough to reach the pier." He looked at Elena, his eyes tired and honest. "I spoke to the Admiral today. He's a friend. He told me that the Navy doesn't want a story about a chief who can hear steel. They want a story about a structural failure that was managed by a competent chain of command. They want the official version, Vance, because the alternative means the manuals are wrong. It means the training is incomplete. It means there are things in the water that they can't control." "What did you tell him, sir?" Miller stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of the naval base. "I told him that I've spent 30 years in the Navy. I've seen men do things that shouldn't be possible. I've seen luck that looked like providence. And I've seen one chief petty officer who knew my ship better than the men who built her." He turned back to her. "I also told him that I'm a captain, and a captain's first duty is to the institution. If I support your version of events, if I tell them that you acted without orders and that I let you do it because I felt you were right, then I'm handing them my sword. I'm admitting that I lost control of my command." "I'm not asking you to lose your command, sir," Elena said. "I know you're not," Miller said. "That's the tragedy of it. You're not asking for anything. You never have. You just do the work, but the work has a cost, Elena. And right now, the Navy is deciding who's going to pay it. Sterling is playing his games, the JAGs are looking for their scapegoat, and the engineers are trying to figure out why the metal didn't melt." He walked to the bed and placed his hand over her bandaged one. It was a heavy, solid weight. "Tomorrow morning, they're going to ask you a question," Miller said. "They're going to ask you if you were acting under orders. If you say yes, you're safe. You'll be the hero of the Tallmadge and you'll walk away with everything you've earned. If you say no, if you tell them the truth, they will dismantle you. They will take your rank, your reputation, and your future. They will call you a liability and a rogue." He squeezed her hand, a brief, painful pressure. "I can't tell you what to do, Chief. I can only tell you that the institution will survive either way. It's built to survive. You're the only one who has to decide if you can survive being a part of their lie." He left, and for the first time since the storm, Elena felt fear. It wasn't the fear of the steam or the water. It was the fear of the silence. She looked at her hands, the pink, useless skin, and realized she was standing on the edge of a different kind of abyss, one where there were no frequencies to guide her, no vibrations to follow. The morning of the hearing arrived with a brutal, clear light. The nurses dressed her in her summer whites, the fabric crisp and stiff against her scarred skin. They had to pin her medals on for her, their fingers fumbling with the small brass clasps. Her chief's anchors felt heavier than they ever had before, 2 pieces of gold that seemed to pull at her collar, demanding a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. They put her in a wheelchair despite her protests. Hospital policy, the nurse said, but Elena knew it was more than that. It was optics. A wounded hero in a wheelchair was a powerful image. A woman who couldn't close her hands was a sympathetic figure. They were already dressing the stage. The hearing was held in a conference room at the base headquarters, a space that smelled of stale coffee and old wood. There were 5 officers on the board, 3 of them captains, one a rear admiral with a face like a hawk. They sat behind a long table, their eyes fixed on the folders in front of them. The room was full of people, JAG officers, stenographers, and a few high-ranking engineers from NAVSEA. In the back row, she saw Sketch. He was sitting straight, his cover on his knee, his eyes locked on her. Next to him was Ensign Taylor, his leg in a heavy cast, his face pale but determined. They were the witnesses to the truth, the ones who had been in the dark with her. Sterling was already there, sitting at a small table to the side. He looked impeccable, his uniform spotless, his hands steady as he arranged his notes. He didn't look at Elena, he looked at the Admiral. He was ready to play his part. "Chief Petty Officer Elena Vance," the Admiral said. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Elena felt it in her feet, a tiny, familiar thrum. She closed her eyes for a second, reaching for it, but it was faint, a ghost of a frequency drowned out by the shuffle of papers. "Present, sir," Elena said. Her voice was clear, the chief voice she had used on the deck plates for 15 years. "Chief Vance, you are here to provide testimony regarding the engineering casualty on the USS Tallmadge on the night of the 14th. The Admiral continued. "We have reviewed the statements of Lieutenant Commander Sterling and Captain Miller. We have also reviewed the technical data from the ship's sensors. There are significant gaps in the narrative, Chief, gaps that only you can fill." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Before we begin, I want to remind you that this is an official inquiry. Your words will be recorded. They will form the basis of the final report that goes to the Secretary of the Navy. Do you understand the weight of this moment?" "I do, sir," Elena said. "Good. Let's start with the ballast flood. Lieutenant Commander Sterling testifies that he authorized the flood at 0214 hours. He states that he gave the order directly to you in the pump room. Is that correct?" The room went silent. It was a physical weight, a pressure that pushed against Elena's chest. She could feel Sterling's gaze now, a sharp, desperate heat on the side of her face. She could feel Captain Miller's presence behind her, a solid, waiting shadow. She looked at her hands, resting in her lap. The white gauze was gone, replaced by thin, flesh-colored pressure sleeves. She couldn't feel the fabric. She couldn't feel the chair. She was a woman cut off from the world, a ghost sitting in a room full of men who wanted to make her a legend or a ghost. "Chief Vance," the Admiral prompted. "Did you receive a direct order from Lieutenant Commander Sterling to initiate the ballast flood at 0214 hours? Elena looked up. She didn't look at Sterling. She didn't look at the Admiral. She looked at the wall, at a framed photograph of the Tallmadge under full steam, her bow cutting through a calm blue sea. She thought about the deep water. She thought about the sound of the keel snapping, that high, crystalline crack that only she had heard. She thought about the frequency of the steam, the sea-sharp that had tried to kill her. She felt a vibration then. It wasn't in her hands. It wasn't in her feet. It was in her spine, a low, rhythmic thrumming that came from the base of the building itself. It was the sound of the world, the hum of the earth, the vibration of the city, the complex, beautiful machinery of existence. She realized then that the sight wasn't in her hands. It never had been. The hands were just the tools. The sight was in the marrow. It was in the decision to listen when everyone else was shouting. "No, sir," Elena said. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the room, cutting through the silence like a blade. "I did not." The room exhaled a collective, sharp intake of breath. Sterling's chair creaked. The Admiral's eyebrows shot up. The stenographer's fingers paused over the keys. "Explain that statement, Chief," the Admiral said, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. "The order was not given," Elena said. She turned her head, her eyes locking onto Sterling's. He looked like he was about to vomit. "The commander was on the ladder. He was..." Unable to speak. "The ship was dying, sir. I felt the keel fail. I didn't need an order to know that the ballast had to be shifted. I acted on my own authority. I acted because I was the only one in that room who was listening to the ship. Acting on your own authority, the Admiral repeated, the words sounding like a death sentence. You bypassed the chain of command during a grade Alpha emergency. You authorized a high-risk flood that could have capsized the vessel without a direct order. Yes, sir, Elena said. She felt a strange, cold peace settling over her. And then I went to the engine room and closed the isolation valve, also without orders, because the commander told me to evacuate and the ship told me to stay. The Admiral leaned back, his face unreadable. The other board members were whispering, their faces tight with a mixture of shock and something that looked like disgust. You realize what you're saying, Vance? The Admiral asked. You're admitting to multiple counts of insubordination and the unauthorized operation of critical ship systems. You're contradicting the sworn testimony of your superior officer. I'm telling the truth, sir, Elena said. The truth is that the Tallmadge is at the pier because I broke the rules. If I had followed the orders I was given, 300 men would be at the bottom of the Atlantic. You can call it what you want. You can take my rank. You can throw me out of the Navy, but you cannot change what happened in that water. She stood up then. It was a slow, painful movement, her legs shaking, her burned arm throbbing with a dull, insistent heat. She didn't use the wheelchair. She stood on her own 2 feet, her back straight, her chin up. I have nothing else to say to this board, Elena said. She turned and began to walk toward the door. The room was dead silent. Every eye was on her, the rogue chief, the unexplained part, the woman who had just set her own career on fire to protect the memory of a ship that was already being turned into scrap. She reached the door and put her hand on the heavy brass handle. She couldn't feel the metal. She couldn't feel the cold. But as she pulled the door open, she felt a vibration in her chest, a deep, resonant B-flat that wasn't a ship and wasn't a machine. It was her own heart. She walked out into the hallway, the bright Virginia sun pouring through the windows. She didn't look back. She didn't look at the JAG officers or the doctors or the men in suits. She walked toward the exit, her boots clicking on the linoleum with a steady, rhythmic cadence. She was halfway to the parking lot when she heard the footsteps behind her. Chief! It was Captain Miller. He was running, his breath coming in heavy gasps, his face flushed. He caught up to her near the gate, his hand coming out to stop her. Vance, wait, he said. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't identify, a mixture of horror and profound respect. They're going into executive session, the Admiral. He's furious. Sterling is being detained for questioning. You just blew the whole thing apart. I know, sir, Elena said. Why? Miller asked, his voice a whisper. You could have had the deal, you could have been the hero. Why would you do this to yourself? Elena looked at him, and for the first time she smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it was real. Because the ship knew, sir, she said, and I couldn't lie to her. She turned and walked away, leaving the captain standing alone on the asphalt. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know what the next hour or the next day would hold. She only knew that the silence was gone. The world was full of noise again, the wind in the trees, the tires on the road, the distant, persistent thrum of the bass. She reached her car and sat in the driver's seat, her ruined hands resting on the steering wheel. She couldn't feel the leather. She couldn't feel the key. But as she looked into the rearview mirror, she saw a woman she finally recognized. The reckoning was far from over. The Navy was just getting started. But as the sun climbed higher into the sky, Elena Vance felt a new frequency, a high, clear note that didn't come from a ship or a machine. It was the sound of her own voice, and for the first time in 15 years, she was the only one who needed to hear it. She turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. She felt the vibration in her spine, the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the machine. It wasn't the Tallmadge asterisk. It was something new. And as she pulled out of the parking lot, she knew that the end of the story was still waiting for her, somewhere just over the horizon. The vibration of the old Honda's steering wheel was a jagged, uneven rhythm that Elena felt all the way up her spine. She sat in the driver's seat in the base headquarters parking lot, her hands in their flesh-colored compression sleeves resting at 10 and 2. She couldn't feel the texture of the worn plastic. She couldn't feel the heat of the Virginia sun baking the dashboard. She only felt the tremor of the idling engine, a low-frequency hum that seemed to be searching for a resonance it couldn't quite find. In the rearview mirror, the headquarters building looked like a fortress of beige brick and glass, a monument to the hierarchy she had just dismantled with less than 100 words. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't feel like a martyr. She felt like a piece of machinery that had been overstressed past its yield point, waiting for the inevitable snap. The drive back to her small apartment in Ghent was a blur of traffic and the persistent, rhythmic clicking of her turn signal. Every sound was magnified. The hiss of the tires on the asphalt, the distant roar of a jet taking off from Chambers Field, the rhythmic thumping of a loose belt under her hood. She was hyper-aware of the mechanical world around her, even as her own body felt like a foreign country. She pulled into her spot, killed the engine, and for a long time she just sat in the silence. It wasn't the silence of the hospital, which had been sterile and fearful. This was the silence of an empty space where a life used to be. For 15 years, the Navy had provided the soundtrack to her existence. The 0600 bells, the drone of the ventilation, the constant, comforting heartbeat of the propulsion plant. Without it, the world felt dangerously thin. The official notification of her administrative separation arrived 3 days later. It wasn't a court-martial, which would have been too public, too messy for an institution currently trying to explain why a multi-billion-dollar destroyer was being sold for scrap. Instead, it was a best interest of the service discharge. No honors, no ceremony, just a thick envelope of paperwork and a date to turn in her ID card. Lieutenant Commander Sterling, she heard through the grapevine of the chief's mess, had been reassigned to a desk job in Great Lakes, his career effectively entombed in a windowless office where he could do no further damage. Captain Miller was being forced into early retirement. The Tallmadge was the sacrifice, and they were the ritual offerings. Elena spent the first week in a state of controlled motion. She cleaned her apartment until the scent of bleach replaced the metallic tang of the hospital. She organized her tools, the heavy wrenches, the precision calipers, the specialized sensors she had bought with her own money over the years. She handled them with her sleeves on, her movements deliberate and slow. She couldn't feel the weight of the steel, but she knew the balance of every tool by heart. She was a woman who lived in the margins of what was possible, and she was learning to navigate a world where she was no longer the master of the machine. On the 8th day, there was a knock at the door. It was 1900, the sky over Norfolk turning a bruised purple. She knew the rhythm of the knock before she even reached the handle. 3 quick raps, a pause, and then a heavier thud. Sketch. When she opened the door, he was standing there in civilian clothes, a faded flannel shirt and jeans that had seen better days. He looked tired. He was carrying a cardboard box and a 6-pack of cheap beer. He didn't ask to come in, he just waited until she stepped aside. "I brought your locker," Sketch said, his voice low. He set the box on her kitchen table. It was filled with the small, personal debris of a decade at sea. A coffee mug with a chipped handle, a stack of technical manuals, a framed photo of her mother, and her chief's anchors tossed carelessly on top of a pile of utility uniforms. "Thanks, Sketch," Elena said. She didn't look at the anchors. "They're towing her tomorrow," he said, sitting at the table and cracking a beer. He didn't offer her one. He knew she couldn't grip the can properly yet. "The Tallmadge 0400, they're taking her up the coast to the yard, no lights, no fanfare, just a tug and a cable." Elena sat across from him, her sleeved hands resting on the table. "It's better that way, she shouldn't be a spectacle." "The guys, we went down there today," Sketch said. He looked at his hands, his knuckles still scarred from the night of the storm. "We stood on the pier, we didn't say anything, we just stood there. Security tried to move us along, but we didn't budge. We stayed until the sun went down." "You shouldn't have done that," Elena said, though there was no sting in the words. "You're already on thin ice with the new CO. Let them freeze the lake," Sketch spat. He looked up at her, his eyes bright with a fierce, protective loyalty. "You saved us, Chief, and they're treating you like a ghost. I got my evaluation yesterday. Exceeds expectations in everything, but a not recommended for promotion because of my association with unauthorized actions. They're trying to scrub us out, Elena, all of us who were in that hole." "It's the way the machine works, Sketch," she said quietly. "When a part fails, you replace it. If the whole system is compromised, you reboot. We're the compromise." "I'm getting out," he said. The words were flat, final. "I put in my papers today. I'm not serving a Navy that hides the truth because it's inconvenient. I'm going back to Pittsburgh. My brother has a shop. We fix things, real things, engines that don't lie to you. He reached into the cardboard box and pulled out the charcoal drawing he had shown her in the hospital. He laid it on the table between them. Elena looked at the image of herself, the ghost in the steam, her hand pressed against the bulkhead. I want you to keep this, Sketch said, to remind you that we saw you, even if the Admiral didn't, even if the reports don't say it, we saw what you are. He left an hour later, a brief, awkward hug, the only goodbye they could manage. Elena stood at the window and watched his truck pull away, the red tail lights disappearing into the Norfolk night. She felt a sharp, hollow ache in her chest, the cost of loyalty. It wasn't a clean thing. It was messy and expensive, and it left you standing alone in a quiet room with a box of memories and a ruined career. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the dark, listening to the world. She heard the distant hum of the Hampton Roads bridge tunnel, a low-frequency vibration that shifted as the tide came in. She heard the rhythmic clinking of a flagpole in the wind 2 blocks away. She realized that the sight wasn't gone. It had changed. Without the constant, overwhelming roar of the ship, the smaller frequencies were coming through. She could hear the stress in the floorboards of her apartment. She could hear the uneven rotation of the ceiling fan in the bedroom. It was a quieter, more intimate version of the power she had always possessed. It was the frequency of the everyday. At 0330, she got into her car. She drove through the quiet streets of Norfolk, past the darkened storefronts and the empty shipyards, toward the water. She didn't go to Pier 12. She went to a small, public park near the mouth of the Elizabeth River, a place where the trees were bent by the salt wind, and the pier was nothing more than a few rotting pilings. The air was cold and damp, the fog rolling off the water in thick gray ribbons. Elena walked to the water's edge, her boots sinking into the wet sand. She waited. The Tallmadge appeared out of the mist at 0415. She looked like a shadow of a shadow, a massive blackened shape being pulled by a single powerful tugboat. There were no lights on the ship. Her masts were bare, her radar dishes motionless. She looked smaller than Elena remembered, a broken toy being dragged away to be forgotten. As the ship passed, Elena closed her eyes. She reached out with her mind, searching for the frequency she knew better than her own heartbeat. She expected silence. She expected the dead, hollow resonance of a decommissioned hull. But then she felt it. It was a very low, almost subsonic vibration coming across the water like a whisper. It wasn't the roar of the boilers or the whine of the turbines. It was the internal stress of the steel, the ship's own unique resonance reacting to the pull of the tug and the pressure of the tide. It was the B-flat of the Tallmadge faint and distorted, but still there. The ship was still breathing, in her own way. She was still holding together, still fighting the water even as she was being led to her grave. Elena stood there until the mist swallowed the ship again, until the sound of the tugboat's engines faded into the distance. She felt a strange, cold peace. The Navy had taken her rank, her hands, and her future. But they couldn't take the connection. They couldn't take the fact that for one terrible, beautiful night, she and the ship had been the same thing. The months that followed were a slow, methodical reconstruction. Elena sold most of her things and moved to a small town on the eastern shore, a place where the world was made of water and wood instead of steel and steam. She bought a small, dilapidated workshop on the edge of a creek, a place that smelled of sawdust and old grease. Physical therapy became her full-time job. She spent hours every day submerged in warm wax, stretching the scar tissue, forcing her fingers to remember the shape of the world. It was a brutal, agonizing process. The pain was a constant companion, a sharp, electric fire that flared every time she tried to make a fist. But she didn't flinch. She didn't beg for more meds. She treated her hands like she had treated the Tallmadge as a machine that needed to be maintained no matter how much it cost. By the 6-month mark, she could close her right hand. By the 8th month, she could pick up a coin. She still couldn't feel the temperature or the texture, but the strength was returning. She learned to use her other senses to compensate. She watched the way the metal glinted to tell if it was hot. She listened to the sound of a screw turning to know if it was tight. She became a creature of observation, a scientist of the physical world. One Tuesday morning in November, a man she didn't recognize pulled into the gravel drive of her workshop. He was driving a clean, white Ford F-150, and he was wearing a suit that looked out of place against the marsh grass. He was older, with gray hair and a face that had been carved out of granite. "Elena Vance?" he asked, stepping out of the truck. Elena was at her workbench, tearing down a small outboard engine. She didn't stop. "Who's asking?" "My name is Garrett. I'm with NAVSEA, specifically the Accident Investigation Division." Elena paused, the wrench in her hand hovering over a bolt. "The *Tallmadge* report is finished, mister." "Garrett, I read it. Structural failure due to age and environmental stress. Human error in navigation. It was a very clean piece of fiction." Garrett walked into the shop, his eyes scanning the tools, the diagrams pinned to the walls, the precision with which everything was laid out. The public report was clean, yes. The internal report, the one that stays in the vault. That one is a little more complicated. It mentions a chief petty officer who heard a hull snap 4 minutes before the sensors did. It mentions a ballast shift that shouldn't have been possible. And it mentions an isolation valve that was closed by hand when the ambient temperature was 400 degrees. He stopped at the edge of her workbench. "We've been running simulations for 6 months, Vance. We've used the best computers in the world. We've used the best engineers in the Navy, and not one of them can explain how that ship stayed afloat. According to every law of physics we have, you should be at the bottom of the ocean." "Maybe your laws are missing a variable," Elena said. She turned back to the engine, her movements precise and controlled. "That's why I'm here," Garrett said. "The Navy is building the next generation of littoral combat ships. They are faster, they are stealthier, and they are full of sensors that cost more than a small country. But they are also fragile. They don't have the soul of the old ships. We're finding that the automated systems can't account for the anomalies of the deep water." He leaned against the workbench, his voice dropping. "We don't want a chief, Elena. We don't want someone to follow the manuals. We want a consultant, someone who can teach our engineers how to listen, someone who can look at a design and tell us where it's going to fail before we ever lay the keel." Elena looked at him, and for a moment she saw the ghost of the institution. She saw the same machine that had tried to bury her, now reaching out its hand because it had realized it couldn't function without the parts it had discarded. "I'm not a teacher," Elena said, "and I'm definitely not a consultant." "You're the only person who knows what happened in that engine room," Garrett said. "You're the only one who knows the frequency. We're offering you a civilian contract. Full benefits, a salary that would make an admiral weep, and a lab in San Diego. You'd have total autonomy, no uniforms, no chain of command, just you and the machines." Elena looked at her hands. The scar tissue was dark and thick, a permanent map of the cost she had paid. She thought about the *Tallmadge* towed away in the dark. She thought about Sketch fixing small engines in Pittsburgh. She thought about the silence of the Navy. "No," she said. Garrett blinked, clearly not expecting the answer. "I don't think you understand the offer, Vance. This is a chance to have your career back, to be at the top of your field, to influence the future of the entire fleet." "I have my career," Elena said, gesturing to the small, greasy shop around her. "I fix things that people care about. I listen to engines that don't belong to a government. And when I'm done, the people thank me. It's a very simple system. I think I'll stick with it." Garrett looked around the shop again, his expression shifting from confusion to a strange kind of envy. "You're really going to stay here, fixing outboard motors and lawnmowers? You're one of the most gifted engineers I've ever seen, and you're wasting it on this." "I'm not wasting anything," Elena said, her voice like steel. "I'm exactly where I need to be. The Navy wanted an ordinary woman. They worked very hard to make me one. They shouldn't be surprised when I decide to live like one." Garrett stayed for another 10 minutes trying to find a crack in her resolve, but he eventually realized there was nothing to find. Elena was a woman who had been through the fire and come out tempered. She didn't need the validation of the institution anymore. She didn't need the anchors or the uniform. She had the only thing that mattered, the truth of what she was. After he left, the shop felt larger, the air clearer. Elena went back to the outboard engine. It was an old Johnson, 20 horsepower, its casing rusted and its carburetor gummed up with salt. She worked for hours, her hands moving with a grace that was born of 1,000 repetitions. She didn't need to feel the metal. She could hear the way the parts fit together. She could hear the tension in the springs, the alignment of the valves, the tiny, microscopic imperfections in the casting. As the sun began to set over the marsh, she finished the reassembly. She carried the engine to the testing tank at the back of the shop, a large plastic drum filled with water. She clamped the engine to the side, primed the bulb, and wrapped the pull cord around her hand. She paused for a moment, the silence of the shop settling over her. She thought about the *Tallmadge one last time. She thought about the C-sharp of the steam and the B-flat of the hull. She realized that she wasn't mourning the ship anymore. She was mourning the woman she had been before the storm, the woman who had believed that the institution would love her back if she just worked hard enough. That woman was gone. In her place was someone different, someone who knew that the only loyalty that mattered was the loyalty to the work itself. She pulled the cord. The engine didn't catch the first time, or the second, but on the third pull it roared to life with a sharp, rhythmic bark. The water in the tank churned into a white froth, the vibrations traveling up the metal casing and into Elena's hands. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the vibration, closing her eyes. She felt the frequency of the engine, a bright, clear G major that was honest and simple. It was a good sound. It was the sound of something being fixed. She stayed there for a long time, her hands pressed against the vibrating metal, the scent of gasoline and salt air filling the shop. She was a woman in a small town with ruined hands and a forgotten name, but as the engine hummed in the twilight, she knew that she had never been more powerful. She had found the frequency of herself. The next morning, the winter's first frost had turned the marsh into a landscape of silver and glass. Elena was up before the sun, as she always was. She made a pot of coffee, the strong, black stuff that tasted of the sea, and sat on the small porch of her workshop. She watched the light slowly pull the world out of the shadows, the reeds turning from gray to gold, the water of the creek reflecting the pale blue of the sky. She thought about Sketch. She had received a postcard from him a few days ago. It was a picture of the Pittsburgh skyline, the three rivers meeting under a canopy of steel bridges. On the back, he had written only 3 words, *it sounds right. She knew exactly what he meant. He was listening to the world just like she was. They were the ones who had been in the dark, and they were the ones who had come out with the ability to hear the things that everyone else ignored. It was a lonely gift, but it was theirs. She finished her coffee and walked back into the shop. There was a new project waiting for her, a generator from a local oyster boat that had been submerged in a storm. It was a mess of corroded wire and seized bearings, the kind of job that most mechanics would have turned away. Elena looked at the machine, her mind already beginning to map out the reconstruction. She felt a familiar pull, a deep, rhythmic thrumming in her chest that had nothing to do with the machines around her. It was the vibration of the world itself, the complex, beautiful, terrifying machinery of life. She reached out and touched the casing of the generator. The metal was cold, but beneath the surface she could hear the potential for motion. She could hear the way the copper would sing once the current began to flow. She could hear the way the bearings would hum once the friction was gone. She picked up her wrench, her movements sure and steady. She didn't need a medal. She didn't need a parade. She had the work, and the work was enough. The Navy would go on building its ships, and the world would go on pretending that it was in control. But in a small workshop on the edge of a creek, a woman named Elena Vance would go on listening to the truth. As the first oyster boat of the morning headed out to the bay, the sound of its engine echoing across the water, Elena began to turn the first bolt. The sound of the wrench against the steel was a high, clear note that cut through the silence of the morning. It was the only sound she needed to hear. The winter deepened, the marsh turning a brittle, frozen brown. Elena's life settled into a rhythm that was as steady as the tide. She worked during the day, her shop becoming a sanctuary for the broken things of the eastern shore. The locals began to talk about the woman with the scarred hands who could fix anything, the one who didn't say much but who always seemed to know what was wrong before she even opened the casing. They didn't know she was a chief petty officer. They didn't know about the *Tallmadge* or the storm or the admiral's hearing. To them, she was just Elena, the mechanic who listened. And that was exactly how she wanted it. One evening, as she was closing up the shop, she saw a car parked at the end of the gravel drive. It was a black SUV, its engine idling, its headlights cutting through the gathering gloom. She waited, her hand resting on the heavy sliding door of the workshop. A woman got out of the car. She was young, in her early 20s, wearing a Navy flight suit with the patches of a helicopter pilot. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around the quiet marsh before settling on Elena. "Chief Vance?" the pilot asked, her voice cracking slightly. Elena didn't move. "I don't go by that name anymore." The pilot walked closer, the light from the shop catching the gold wings on her chest. "My name is Lieutenant J.G. Sarah Miller, my father. He told me where to find you." Elena's heart skipped a beat. Captain Miller's daughter, she looked like him, the same stubborn set of the jaw, the same honest eyes. "Your father is a good man, Lieutenant," Elena said. "He's a retired man," Sarah said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "He spends most of his time on his boat, but he talks about you. He says you're the reason I'm still flying." "I don't see how that's possible," Elena said. "He told me what happened on the Tallmadge asterisk," Sarah said, her voice dropping. "Not the version in the report, the real version. He said you saved the ship because you heard it breaking, and he said you walked away from everything because you wouldn't lie about it." She stepped into the light of the doorway, her expression turning serious. "I'm flying the MH-60R now, Chief. It's a great bird, but lately there's been a vibration in the tail rotor. The mechanics say it's within tolerances. The sensors say everything is green. But I feel it in my seat, in my hands. It feels wrong." She looked at Elena, her eyes full of a desperate, quiet hope. "Nobody believes me. They think I'm just a nervous JG, but my father said. He said if anyone in the world could tell me what my bird is trying to say, it would be you." Elena looked at the young pilot, and for a moment she saw herself. She saw the woman who had stood on the deck of the Tallmadge asterisk, hearing the world crack while everyone else was looking at the dials. She looked at her own hands, the dark scar tissue a permanent reminder of the cost of listening. She thought about the peace she had found in the marsh, the quiet life she had built for herself. She thought about the danger of going back, even for a moment, into the world of the machine. But then she felt the vibration. It wasn't in the air or the ground. It was in the resonance of the woman standing in front of her, the frequency of someone who knew the truth and was being told it was a lie. "Where is the bird, Lieutenant?" Elena asked. "At NAS Oceana," Sarah said, her breath catching in her throat. "I can get you on base. I have a night top at 2,200. If we go now." Elena didn't hesitate. She grabbed her heavy coat and her specialized sensor kit, the one she hadn't opened since she left Norfolk. She locked the shop door, the metallic click of the bolt sounding like a period at the end of a sentence. The drive to Oceana was silent. Elena watched the lights of the highway, the world turning back into the familiar landscape of the Navy. The gates, the guards, the gray silhouettes of the hangars against the night sky. She felt the old weight returning, the pressure of the institution, but it didn't scare her anymore. She wasn't a part of the machine. She was an outside observer, a ghost returning to the scene of the crime. They found the Seahawk in a corner of the flight line, its rotors tied down, its skin gleaming under the sodium lights. It looked powerful and dangerous, a predator of the air. "Wait here," Sarah said, heading toward the maintenance shack to check the logs. Elena walked to the helicopter. She didn't look at the sensors or the cockpit. She walked to the tail, her boots crunching on the cold asphalt. She reached out and placed her hands, the sleeved, ruined hands, against the metal of the tail pylon. She closed her eyes. She didn't try to hear the engine. She didn't try to hear the rotor. She went deeper. She searched for the resonance of the airframe, the way the metal spoke to itself. At first, there was nothing but the cold, dead silence of the night. But then she felt it. It was a tiny, high-frequency shudder, hidden beneath the ambient noise of the bass. It was a discordant note, a jagged edge in the smooth C major of the helicopter's design. It wasn't in the rotor. It was in the bearing housing of the drive shaft, a microscopic fracture that was vibrating at a frequency that no sensor would ever pick up. It was a death rattle. She stayed there for a long time, her hands pressed against the metal, feeling the vibration grow and fade as the wind moved the rotor blades. She could hear the future. She could hear the moment the fracture would give way, the tail rotor spinning off into the dark, the helicopter falling out of the sky like a wounded bird. "Chief!" It was Sarah. She was standing a few feet away, her face pale in the moonlight. Elena opened her eyes. She looked at the young pilot and she felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness. She knew what the Navy would do. They would tell her she was crazy. They would tell her to fly the mission. And when the helicopter crashed, they would blame pilot error. The bearing housing, Elena said, her voice a low rasp. The third one from the hub. There's a hairline fracture in the inner race. It's vibrating at 440 hertz. Every time the rotor hits 100%, the vibration doubles. It's going to fail, Sarah. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it's going to fail. Sarah looked at the tail of the helicopter, then back at Elena. The logs say the bearing was replaced last week. It's brand new. Then the part was flawed from the factory, Elena said, or it was over-torqued during installation. It doesn't matter why. It only matters that it's there. They won't believe me, Sarah whispered. I'm a JG. If I refuse to fly, they'll pull my wings. They'll say I'm unstable, just like they said about you. Elena walked over to her. She took the young woman's hands in hers. The pilot's hands were soft and warm, the hands of someone who hadn't yet been broken by the world. You don't need them to believe you, Elena said. You only need to be right. Go to the maintenance master chief. Tell him to run a dye-penetrant test on that specific bearing, not a sensor check. A physical test. Tell him that if he doesn't find the crack, you'll resign your commission on the spot. And if he doesn't find it? Sarah asked. He will, Elena said, because the metal doesn't lie, only people do. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the flight line before the guards could see her. She didn't wait for the result. She didn't wait for the thank you. She drove back to the eastern shore, the vibration of the road feeling like a conversation she was finally finished having. 2 days later, a package arrived at her workshop. There was no note, just a small, heavy piece of metal. It was a bearing race, cracked almost perfectly in half. In the light of the shop, the fracture looked like a jagged lightning bolt, a frozen moment of failure. Elena looked at the piece of steel for a long time. She felt a strange, quiet satisfaction. She hadn't saved a ship this time. She had saved one woman, one life, and in the end, that was more than enough. She placed the bearing on her workbench next to the charcoal drawing sketch had given her. It was her new collection, the evidence of the things she had seen in the dark. The winter began to fade, the first hints of spring appearing in the marsh. The world was waking up again, the frequencies shifting as the life returned to the water. Elena worked in her shop, the sound of her tools a steady, rhythmic cadence. She was a woman who had lost everything and in doing so had found the only thing that mattered. She was the one who listened. She was the ghost in the machine, the witness to the truth, the woman who knew that the world was always speaking if you only had the courage to hear it. On a quiet Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after the Tallmadge had been towed away, Elena stood on the edge of her pier. The water was calm, the sky a clear, brilliant blue. She felt the vibration of the world beneath her feet, the hum of the earth, the pull of the tide, the distant, rhythmic heartbeat of the sea. She closed her eyes and reached out with her mind, searching for the frequency of the future. She heard the sound of a new ship, far out on the horizon. She heard the sound of a young pilot flying through the clear blue sky. She heard the sound of a man in Pittsburgh fixing an engine that finally sounded right. And then she heard herself. It was a high, clear note, a perfect resonance that didn't need a ship or a machine or a uniform to exist. It was the sound of a woman who was finally, truly free. She turned and walked back toward her shop, the sound of her boots on the wooden pier a steady, rhythmic beat. She had work to do. She had things to fix. She had a world to listen to. And as she stepped into the shadows of the workshop, the light of the morning sun caught the dark scar tissue on her hands, turning the ruined skin into something that looked like gold. The Navy was a machine, and the machine would always go on. But Elena Vance was a woman, and a woman was something the machine could never truly own. She picked up her wrench, the metal feeling cold and solid in her hand. She didn't need to feel the temperature. She didn't need to feel the texture. She already knew exactly what the steel was going to say. The air in the workshop was still, the only sound the soft ticking of a wall clock and the distant cry of a gull. Elena stood over the disassembled generator, her mind moving through the sequence of the repair with the ease of a master. She wasn't thinking about the past. She wasn't thinking about the cost. She was just thinking about the work. She reached for a small, precision screwdriver, her fingers moving with a grace that was no longer a memory but a new, hard-earned reality. She found the screw, felt the resistance, and turned it until the frequency of the metal shifted into alignment. It was a small thing, a quiet thing, but in that moment it was the most important thing in the world. She was Elena Vance, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The sun climbed higher into the sky, the light flooding the workshop, illuminating the dust motes and the grease stains and the charcoal drawing on the wall. It was a beautiful day, a simple day, a day that belonged to her and no one else. She picked up the next part, the metal singing to her in a language only she could understand. She didn't need to be a hero anymore. She just needed to be the woman who heard the truth. The world was full of noise, but in the quiet of the marsh, Elena Vance had finally found the one thing the Navy could never give her. She had found the silence that belonged only to her. She worked until the shadows began to lengthen again, the generator finally reassembled and ready for the water. She carried it to the door, the weight of the machine a familiar, comforting pressure. She looked out at the creek, at the way the light danced on the surface of the water, at the way the reeds swayed in the salt wind. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of joy, a feeling so intense it almost took her breath away. It wasn't the joy of a victory or the relief of an escape. It was the joy of being alive, of being present, of being a part of the beautiful, terrifying machine of the world. She set the generator down and walked to the edge of the water. She reached out and touched the surface, the coldness of the creek a distant, vibrating pressure against her scarred skin. She closed her eyes and listened. She heard the tide coming in. She heard the fish moving in the shadows. She heard the heartbeat of the earth. And then she heard the ship, not the Tallmadge asterisk, not a destroyer. She heard the sound of a small wooden boat, its engine a steady, rhythmic hum, its hull cutting through the water with a grace that was older than steel. She opened her eyes and saw it, a small white skiff heading up the creek toward her shop. A man was at the tiller, his hand resting on the engine, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He saw her standing on the pier and raised a hand in a quiet, respectful greeting. Elena raised her hand in return. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know where he was going, but she knew the sound of his boat. It was a good sound, a true sound. A sound that meant everything was exactly as it should be. She watched the boat disappear around the bend in the creek, the sound of its engine lingering in the air like a memory. She turned and walked back into her shop, the shadows swallowing her as she moved toward the workbench. She had one more job to finish before the sun went down. She picked up her tools, the metal singing to her in the twilight. She was the woman who heard the truth, and the truth was that the work never ended. And that was the most beautiful thing of all. The stars began to appear over the marsh, a billion tiny points of light reflecting in the dark water. The world was quiet, the only sound the rhythmic breathing of the sea. Elena Vance stood in the center of her workshop, her hands resting at her sides, her head bowed in a quiet, private moment of grace. She had paid the cost. She had survived the fire. And now she was the one who kept the world from breaking, one frequency at a time. She reached out and turned off the shop light, the darkness settling over the room like a heavy velvet blanket. She walked to the door, the sound of her boots on the concrete a steady, rhythmic cadence. She stepped out into the night, the salt wind pulling at her hair, the smell of the marsh filling her lungs. She looked up at the stars, at the infinite, beautiful machinery of the universe. She felt the vibration in her spine, the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the world. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a legend. She was just a woman who knew what she knew. She walked toward her house, the light in the window a warm, welcoming glow. The story was over, and the story was just beginning. And for the first time in her life, Elena Vance was the one who was telling it. She sat on her porch for a long time, watching the moon rise over the water. She thought about the Tallmadge sitting in the scrap yard in Philadelphia. She thought about the men she had saved and the man she had destroyed. She thought about the Navy, and the way it would go on, blind and beautiful until the end of time. She felt a sudden, deep sense of gratitude, not for the power or the rank or the survival, but for the silence. The silence that allowed her to hear the truth. The silence that made the world make sense. The silence that was finally, truly her own. She stood up and walked into her house, the sound of the door closing behind her a soft, final click. She was home. The frequency was perfect. The next morning, Elena Vance woke to the sound of the world. She didn't check the clock. She didn't check the sensors. She just lay there in the quiet, listening to the way the house settled, the way the wind moved through the trees, the way the tide pulled at the shore. It was a good day to fix something. She got out of bed, her movements sure and steady, her hands reaching for the world with a confidence that had been forged in the fire. She was Elena Vance, and she was the woman who heard the truth. And the truth was that she was exactly where she belonged. The machinery of the universe hummed in the background, a low-frequency vibration that only she could hear. She smiled. It was a beautiful sound. The shop door slid open with a metallic rasp that Elena felt in the marrow of her bones. The morning light hit the concrete floor, illuminating the fine dust of metal shavings and the ghost outlines of the machines she had breathed life back into. She stepped inside, the smell of oil and salt and old steel welcoming her back. On the workbench, the cracked bearing from Sarah Miller's helicopter sat beside Sketch's drawing, a small altar to the things that had been saved and the things that had been lost. She didn't start working immediately. She stood in the center of the room, her hands in her pockets, simply listening to the building. The workshop had its own voice, the expansion of the metal roof in the sun, the vibration of the refrigerator in the back, the distant, rhythmic thrum of the transformer on the pole outside. It was a complex symphony of the ordinary, and she understood every note of it. She realized then that the Navy hadn't just tried to fix her or break her, they had tried to contain her. They had wanted her sight to be a sensor, a tool they could switch on and off to serve the mission. But the sight wasn't a tool. It was a state of being. It was the refusal to look away when the world showed its seams. It was the discipline to hear the discordance in a world that demanded harmony. She walked to the back of the shop and pulled a heavy tarp off a piece of equipment she had been working on for months. It was an old, industrial generator, salvaged from a decommissioned lighthouse. It was a massive thing, built of cast iron and brass, a relic of an era when things were made to last for centuries. It had been dead for 50 years, its internals frozen by rust and neglect. Elena placed her hand on the cold iron of the casing. She didn't use a wrench. She didn't use a voltmeter. She just closed her eyes and let the silence of the shop settle over her until the only thing left was the resonance of the machine. She felt the frozen gears, the brittle wires, the hollow spaces where the lubricant had long ago turned to dust. But beneath it all, she felt the potential. She felt the be-natural of the iron, the high, clear ring of the brass. The machine wanted to move. It wanted to fulfill the purpose it had been built for. It was waiting for someone to hear it. She spent the next 6 hours in a state of deep, rhythmic labor. She disassembled the generator with a surgical precision, her hands moving through the grease and the grime without hesitation. She cleaned every gear, polished every brass fitting, replaced every brittle wire. She didn't hurry. She didn't worry about the time. She just followed the frequency. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, she reached the final stage of the reassembly. She placed the heavy brass rotor into its housing, the fit so perfect it made a soft, pneumatic hiss. She connected the final wire, tightened the final bolt, and stood back. The generator sat in the center of the shop, a massive, gleaming monument to the persistence of the material world. It looked like it could power a city or a soul. Elena picked up a small canister of fuel. She primed the intake, checked the oil, and wrapped her hand around the heavy iron crank. This wasn't a pull cord. This was a manual start, a physical negotiation between the woman and the machine. She braced her feet against the concrete. She took a deep breath, her lungs filling with the scent of the shop. She thought about the Tallmadge asterisk, and she thought about the fire, and she thought about the silence. She turned the crank. The engine groaned, a heavy metallic sound that echoed through the workshop. She turned it again, the resistance of the iron pushing back against her scarred hands. She turned it a third time, her muscles straining, her heart hammering a rhythmic cadence in her chest. On the fourth turn, the generator roared to life. It wasn't the jagged bark of the outboard motor or the whine of the helicopter. It was a deep, resonant boom that shook the very foundations of the shop. It was a low-frequency hum that vibrated in the air, in the floor, in the marrow of Elena's bones. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The lights in the workshop flickered and then brightened, the old bulbs glowing with a steady, brilliant light that they hadn't seen in half a century. The machines in the shop began to hum in sympathy, their metal casings vibrating with the energy of the generator. Elena stood in the center of the roar, her hands open at her sides, her head tilted back. She felt the frequency of the machine flowing through her, a powerful, rhythmic pulse that connected her to the earth, to the water, to the stars. She wasn't a chief anymore. She wasn't a sailor. She wasn't a civilian. She was the woman who heard the truth, and the truth was that nothing was ever truly broken, nothing was ever truly lost. It was all just waiting for the right frequency to bring it back to life. She stayed there for a long time, the generator humming its deep, steady B-natural, the light of the workshop pushing back the shadows of the marsh. She felt a profound, unshakable peace, the peace of a woman who had finally found the resonance she had been searching for her entire life. She reached out and touched the casing of the generator, the vibration traveling up her arm and into her heart. She was home. The next morning, Elena Vance sat on the pier behind her workshop, her feet dangling over the water. The sun was just beginning to rise, the sky a pale, translucent pink. The air was still, the only sound the soft lap of the tide against the pilings. She looked out at the horizon, at the place where the water met the sky. She felt the vibration of the world, a low, rhythmic hum that was as steady as the tide. She thought about the Navy. She thought about the ships and the men and the machines. She knew they were still out there, searching for the things they couldn't see, fighting the things they didn't understand. She knew they would always be there, a part of the beautiful, terrifying machine of the world. But she also knew that they didn't own her. They didn't own the truth. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was her chief's anchors, the gold tarnished by the salt air, the metal feeling cold and solid in her hand. She looked at the anchors for a long time. She thought about the 15 years she had spent wearing them. She thought about the pride and the pain and the cost. And then she tossed them into the water. They made a small, clean splash, the gold disappearing into the dark shadows of the creek. There were no ripples, there was no sound. The water swallowed them whole, a final offering to the deep. Elena Vance stood up and walked back toward her shop, the sound of her boots on the wooden pier a steady, rhythmic cadence. She had work to do. She had things to fix. She had a world to listen to. And as she stepped into the shadows of the workshop, the light of the morning sun caught the dark scar tissue on her hands, turning the ruined skin into something that looked like gold. She was the woman who heard the truth. The metal doesn't lie.